Smuggler's Wake by Ty Barter. Chapter 1. The Choice. The morning fog clung to Burgeo Harbor like a damp wool blanket, muffling the steady knock of Jack Keating's hammer as it struck against the weathered hull of the briny Rose. Each blow echoed his father's voice, steady, measured, patient. Thud, thud, thud. The kind of rhythm a man develops after 3 decades on the water. Jack paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, the salt of it indistinguishable from the sea spray that had permanently etched itself into the lines of his face. "Dispatch job won't hold true to October storms," he muttered, running calloused fingers over the splintered planking. The wood felt soft in places where it shouldn't, like an old tooth gone bad at the root. The briny Rose had been his father's boat, and his grandfather's before that. His grandfather had commissioned her in 1915, naming her after his wife Rose, though the origin of the briny part remained a family mystery. Now in the autumn of 1952, the 38-foot vessel of stubborn oak and pine had weathered more North Atlantic gales than Jack had years to his name. His grandfather had reportedly taken the old girl all the way to the Caribbean on one epic adventure back in her prime. But lately she'd been taking on water faster than he could bail, not unlike his finances. From the wharf came Herbert Gillam's voice, cutting through the fog. "Catch reports due by noon, Jack. The new fisheries officer's in town." Jack straightened, feeling the familiar tightness in his lower back. Herbert stood above him, a government clipboard tucked imperiously under one arm, pencil mustache twitching like it was trying to escape his face. "Didn't catch enough to warrant the paper it's printed on," Jack called back, hammer still in hand. "Tell him he's welcome to count me empty nets himself." Herbert clicked his tongue. "Regulations are regulations. New quotas coming down from Ottawa next month, too." He rocked on his heels, oddly pleased with the news. "Getting tighter every season." He paused, then continued, leaning forward in a conspiratorial way. "You know, Jack, a well-respected fisherman like yourself could have positive impact on the community by leading by example. By noon, Jack. Noon o'clock." Without waiting for a reply, Herbert turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the frost-covered planks. Jack resumed hammering, each strike now carrying a hint of frustration. 3 years since Newfoundland joined Canada, and already mainlanders were telling them how to fish waters their families had worked for centuries. Jack had voted against Confederation, a choice that still gnawed at him during sleepless nights. Not that his vote had mattered in the end. Progress, they called it. But progress hadn't filled his nets or his pockets. The government men with their tidy desks kept drawing lines on maps, telling fishermen where they could cast nets and how many cod they could pull. Meanwhile, the massive trawlers from the mainland scooped up everything that swam. Quota be damned. The new fishing regulations required daily logbooks and catch reports, a particular challenge in communities where many fishermen, like Jack's own father, had never learned to read or write properly. Dull thuds on the dock planks announced the arrival of Jack's son, Dorman, a gangly boy just shy of 14, with his mother's serious, brilliant blue eyes and Jack's stubborn stature and demeanor. He carried a dented toolbox nearly as big around as his torso. "Mum says don't forget Dr. Parsons is coming for supper," Dorman said, setting down the toolbox with obvious relief. "Your mudder inviting the doctor now? We sick or just can't pay last winter's bill?" Dorman shrugged with the disinterest of youth. "She said something about his daughter. You know, Emily." Dorman looked at his then continued when he didn't respond. "Anyway, she's helping with the school pageant, or something." Jack swallowed a sigh. Margaret was forever trying to create connections in town, weaving social webs that might catch them when the fishing couldn't. 20 years ago, when he'd proposed with a silver band so thin you could see light through it, he'd promised her better than this, a promise the sea had refused to honor. Hand me that caulk and iron, Jack said, pointing into the toolbox. As Dorman dug through the jumbled tools, Jack caught sight of a sleek vessel sliding through the harbor entrance, cutting the fog like a knife. The Queen's Bounty, Danny's boat. Danny, Jack's younger brother by 4 years, had recently managed to acquire a vessel twice as handsome as the Briny Rose. Its hull gleamed even in the muted morning light, fresh glossy black paint stark against the faded vessels around it. "Uncle Danny's back," Dorman observed, abandoning the toolbox search. "Bet he brought me something from away." "Finish your chores first," Jack warned, but Dorman was already scrambling up the ladder to the wharf, eager as a puppy. Jack watched his brother's boat ease toward its berth, a familiar bitterness rising in his throat. The wind whistled through the rigging of nearby vessels. It wasn't jealousy exactly, more like a bone-deep weariness at always being the one who followed rules while others like Danny seemed to skip through life unburdened. Their father had always said Jack was born with an extra dose of conscience. Some days it felt more like a ship's anchor than a virtue. Danny had been gone nearly 2 weeks this time, longer than any routine fishing trip warranted. The pattern had become familiar over the past 6 months. Danny disappearing for stretches, returning with no visible catch but somehow flush enough to buy rounds at Spencer's Tavern. By the time Jack climbed onto the dock, Danny was already holding court, one arm slung around Dorman's shoulders, the other gesturing expansively as he regaled a small crowd with some tale. His laughter carried across the wharf, full-bellied and careless. "50 miles off Cape La Hune, fog so thick you couldn't see your own boots," Danny was saying, "and this monster breaches not 20 feet from starboard. Huge friggin' ting." "A whale?" asked Owen Tucker, a deckhand from the eastern end of town. "Way bigger," Danny insisted, eyes sparkling. "Squid, I reckon. Add a tentacle as thick as a ship's mast." Jack approached, nodding tersely to the gathered men, his boots echoing on the wet planks. Danny's grin widened. "Jackie, just telling these boys about me close call with the Kraken." "Sounds dire," Jack said dryly. "Strange you didn't radio it in." Danny laughed and pulled Jack into a one-armed embrace that smelled of expensive tobacco and cologne no fisherman could afford. "Always the serious one. How's the Rose treating you? Still taking on water in the stern?" "Nodding I can't handle," Jack replied, his voice tight with impatience, acutely aware of the contrast. His patched wool sweater against Danny's new peacoat, his work-worn hands next to Danny's inexplicably smooth ones. The small crowd began to disperse as Danny produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For me, favorite nephew," he announced, handing it to Dorman. The boy tore into it eagerly, revealing a penknife with a mother-of-pearl handle. "Real pearl," Danny said, beaming. "From the French islands." Jack frowned. "Saint Pierre? You fishing in French waters now?" "Just passing the rough," Danny said smoothly. "Sometimes the best routes go where the charts don't show, bye?" Dorman held the knife reverently. It caught what little sunlight penetrated the fog, throwing tiny rainbows against the weathered dock planks. "Thank your uncle," Jack prompted, keeping his tone even despite the unease settling in his gut. "Thanks, Uncle Danny." Dorman grinned, already testing the blade against his thumb. "Careful with dat," Jack and Danny said simultaneously, then shared a brief look that carried the weight of their father's memory, a third presence standing invisibly between them. "Dorm," Jack said, "go tell your mother Uncle Danny's back. See if she needs help with dinner." The boy hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave the men's company, but finally nodded and jogged off toward the cluster of saltbox houses that made up the eastern neighborhood of Burgeo. From his vantage point high on the hill, Dorman paused to look back at the harbor. His father and Uncle Danny stood like opposing forces, one weathered and worn like the Briny Rose herself, the other gleaming and prosperous like his fancy boat. Dorman couldn't hear their words over the cry of gulls and lap of waves, but their body language told him enough. Something was brewing between them, something that made him uneasy. He'd seen the other fishermen's faces when Uncle Danny told his stories, the mixture of envy and suspicion, heard the whispers about where Danny's newfound wealth really came from, the way his father's expression tightened whenever someone mentioned Saint Pierre. Dorman fingered the pearl-handled knife in his pocket. It was easily the finest thing he'd ever owned, certainly nothing his father could afford to give him. He loved and admired his father, but sometimes in secret moments he'd never admit aloud, he envied Uncle Danny's carefree prosperity. With a sigh, he continued up the hill toward home, rehearsing how he'd explain Uncle Danny's return to his mother without mentioning the flash of worry he'd seen in his father's eyes. Once Dorman was out of earshot, Jack turned to his brother. "French islands, Danny. You knows the Coast Guard and the Mounties watched them waters." Danny's smile didn't falter, but his eyes grew sharper. "Let's grab a coffee at the mess hall. Got something to discuss with you?" The fisherman's mess hall was really just a converted Quonset hut left over from the war, where the men gathered for meals when they weren't at sea. At this hour it was nearly empty, save for old Morris Han dozing in the corner, an eternal cup of tea growing cold at his elbow. Danny ordered 2 coffees from Edna behind the counter, sliding a Newfoundland 50-cent piece across, the currency still in circulation despite Confederation with Canada 3 years prior. Edna's eyebrows lifted slightly at the generous tip, but she pocketed it without comment. They settled at a scarred wooden table by the lone window. Outside, the fog was finally burning off, revealing the jumble of fishing stages and outbuildings that crowded the harbor. "You're not even trying to be discreet," Jack said, keeping his voice low. "Flashing money around? The fancy boat? People notice, Danny." Danny stirred 3 heaping spoonfuls of sugar into his coffee. "You knows people mind their business in Burgeo when it comes to the governments. They always have." "Until they don't," Jack said, leaning forward. "What's going on with you? You haven't brought in a real catch in months." A slow smile spread across Danny's face. "That's where you're wrong, brother. I'm bringing in the best catch of me life, just not the kind with gills." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a roll of bills, thumbing through them casually. The denominations were larger than any Jack had seen in years. A mix of new Canadian notes, some American, and the familiar Newfoundland dollars that people still clung to, reluctant to let go of the last pieces of their independent past. Jack felt his throat tighten. "You're running rum." "I prefers import specialist," Danny grinned. "This ain't a joke." Jack pushed aside his untouched coffee. "The Mounties catch you, it's prison. Not to mention what the Coast Guard would do. They'd sink the Queen right out from under you." Danny leaned back, unconcerned. 12 runs so far by. Clean as a whistle each time." 12? Jack couldn't hide his shock. "Lord Thunder and Jesus, Danny." Jack's mind raced. Smuggling wasn't unheard of along Newfoundland's isolated coast, especially not since Confederation had changed the rules again, bringing new taxes and regulations. But it was one thing to turn a blind eye to a neighbor's hidden bottles. It was another entirely to sail directly to Saint Pierre for commercial quantities. "The French don't have our liquor laws. Their ports are full of the good stuff, and they're happy to move it. I've got a contact, Louis Martel. Decent feller, businessman to roughen the rough." Jack rubbed his temples where a headache was forming. "I don't want to hear this." "You'll want to hear the next part." Danny lowered his voice further. "Martel's looking to expand, needs more boats, reliable captains. The pay's better than you'd make in 3 seasons of cod." "No." The word came out sharper than Jack intended, drawing a curious glance from Edna. "Just listen," Danny insisted. 1 run. That's all I'm suggesting. Enough to fix the rows properly, maybe put something aside for dorm schooling." The mention of Dorman made Jack's jaw clench. I don't need rum money for me, boy. No, you'd rather have him patch that derelict boat until he's old and broken like who, Danny? Like Pa. Jack's voice had an edge now. The man who taught us honest work? A shadow crossed Danny's face. Pa died poor and exhausted after breaking his back for nodding but calloused ands in an early grave. The honest work is killing us, Jack. Look around. Those big companies are taking everything, and we're fighting over scraps. The mention of their father hit Jack like a physical blow. Thomas Keating's image flashed before him, not the industrious fisherman Danny described, but the red-faced drunk who terrorized their household, fists flying after too many bottles of the very liquor Danny now smuggled. Jack wanted to argue but found the words sticking in his throat. Last month, he'd been forced to sell his mother's silver serving platter, one of the few fine things they'd owned, just to pay for new fishing line. Margaret had said nothing, but her silence had been worse than any reprimand. How many more pieces of their small dignity would they have to sacrifice before the sea gave back what it owed them? And now here was Danny, offering an easy answer, the kind their father would have refused without a second thought. Jack could almost hear the old man's voice. There's no shortcut to an honest life, Jackie boy. But their father hadn't lived to see the new Canada swallow Newfoundland whole, hadn't watched the bureaucrats and corporations carve up the fishing grounds like a Christmas ham. Maybe the rules of honesty had changed too. One run, Danny repeated, softer now. The Rose is the perfect cover. Nobody would suspect her. Martel's offering $400 up front and Otter 4 after delivery. $800. Almost a year's income from fishing. Jack thought of the rotting planks on the Rose, of Dorman's shoes with the cardboard insoles, of Margaret's tired eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. I needs to think, Jack said finally. Danny drained his coffee and stood up to leave. Don't think too long. Martel's looking for an answer by week's end. He clapped Jack on the shoulder. Tonight at Spencer's, I'm buying rounds to celebrate me successful fishing trip. Bring Margaret. Do her good to have a night out. After Danny left, Jack sat staring into his cooling coffee, seeing nothing but the reflection of his own troubled face. Morris Hand snorted loudly in his sleep from the corner, startling Jack from his thoughts. Outside, the fog had lifted completely, revealing a sky of hard, brilliant blue. Jack walked slowly back toward the briny Rose, his steps heavy with more than physical fatigue, his boots scuffing against the weathered planks. The tide was going out, leaving the smaller boats tilted awkwardly in the mud, looking like beached whales gasping for the returning water. Jack climbed down to his vessel and resumed his repairs, though his heart wasn't in it anymore. Every thud of the hammer seemed to echo Danny's words. As he worked, memories of his father surfaced unbidden. Thomas Keating stumbling home reeking of rum, eyes wild, fists clenched. Jack placing himself between his father and Danny, taking blows meant for his younger brother. Their mother's tearful pleas falling on deaf ears as Thomas raged through their small house. The bitter irony wasn't lost on Jack. He'd spent his entire life avoiding his father's path, swearing he'd never let rum destroy his family as it had destroyed his childhood home. Yet here he was, considering smuggling the very poison that had fueled his father's violence. But wasn't poverty its own kind of violence? The kind that wore you down slowly, eating away at your dignity bite by bite? Jack's hands stilled on the weathered planking. $800 could change everything, could give Dorman opportunities Jack had never had, could ease the worry lines from Margaret's forehead. Just one run, a single compromise, not a lifetime of weakness like his father. 3 hours later, with the sun high overhead, Jack was interrupted by Dorman's return. Mum says dinner's at 6 sharp, the boy announced, then peered at Jack's handiwork. Doesn't look much different. Jack attempted a smile. Sea don't care about appearances, just needs to float. Dorman nodded sagely, as if this was profound wisdom, rather than a tired man's excuse. Can I take the dory out to check the lobster traps? Tide's too low now. We'll go tomorrow. Jack hesitated, then asked, what would you think about going to school in St. John someday? The big Catholic school there? Dorman scrunched his face in confusion. What for? Everything I needs to know is here. Jack studied his son, the way he stood with feet planted wide like a sailor already, how his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. The sea was in the boy's blood, just as it had been in Jack's and his father's before him. But was that enough anymore? The world was changing faster than Burgeo could keep pace. Even now, the mainland companies were buying up independent fishing operations all along the coast. How long before men like Jack would become employees rather than their own masters? Just tinking ahead, Jack said, ruffling his son's hair. Go help your mother now. After Dorman left, Jack climbed back onto the wharf and stared out at the open water. Far to the south, beyond visible reach, lay the French islands of Saint Pierre and Miquelon, tiny specks of Europe clinging to North America's edge, gateways to a world of risk and reward. Margaret knew something was amiss the moment Jack walked through the door that evening. 20 years of marriage had taught her to read his silences like another woman might read recipe books. Danny's schemes again? She asked, not looking up from the pot she was stirring. The aroma of salt beef and cabbage filled their small kitchen. Jack hung his coat on the peg by the door. What makes you say dat? You've got dat look. She finally turned to him, wiping her hands on her apron. At 38, Margaret Keating retained the high cheekbones and clear eyes that had first caught Jack's attention at a parish dance. Life in Burgeo had toughened her hands and added threads of silver to her dark hair, but had never diminished her directness. He's invited us for drinks at Spencer's tonight. Says he's buying. Margaret's eyebrows rose. With what? Last I checked, cod weren't made of gold. Jack hesitated, then decided the partial truth was better than none. He's found some alternative arrangement, bringing in good money. Saint Pierre rum, she said flatly. It wasn't a question. And cigarettes likely. Jack stared at her. How did you? Edna at the mess hall told me he paid Wit a 50-cent piece like it were nothing. And Sarah Parsons mentioned her husband treated Danny for a sprained wrist last month. Said he claimed he'd fallen on his boat, but he smelled like French cologne and had a receipt from a Saint Pierre hotel in his pocket. Margaret stirred the pot more vigorously. This town has no secrets, Jack. You knows that. He wants me to join him, Jack admitted, sinking into a chair at their worn kitchen table. One run, he says. $800. Margaret's stirring stopped abruptly. The wooden spoon clattered against the pot's edge as she turned to face him, her expression a complex mixture of shock, understanding, and fear. Jack Keating, she said slowly, tell me you're not considering this. Jack couldn't meet her eyes. The rose needs repairs I can't afford. Dorm's growing out of his clothes faster than you can patch him. And the new quotas. And your father? Margaret cut in sharply. Have you forgotten what rum did to him? To your mother? To you and Danny? Jack's head snapped up. This is different. I'm not drinking it, just moving it. It's still the devil's water, no matter who's pouring it down their throat. Margaret came to stand before him, her hands on her hips. Your father broke more damn furniture when he was in his cups, Jack. He broke your trust, your childhood. Would you risk breaking what we've built, what Dorman depends on? Her words struck home, cutting through Jack's rationalizations. Images of his father's drunken rages flashed before him. The blood, the broken crockery, his mother's tears. The fear in Danny's eyes as Jack stood between them, taking the blows so his younger brother wouldn't have to. $800, Jack said weakly. Just once. Margaret's expression softened slightly. She pulled a chair close and sat, taking his rough hands in hers. I know tings are hard, Jack. Harder than they've ever been. But your honest name is worth more than any amount Danny's offering. Jack squeezed her hands, grateful for her steadfast conviction, even as doubt gnawed at him. And if the quotas cut deeper? If the rose sinks because I can't afford to fix her proper? Then we'll face that together, as we faced everything else. Margaret's blue eyes, the same ones she'd passed to Dorman, held his gaze firmly. There's always another way, Jack. One that don't involve rum and Mounties in prison. Before Jack could respond, the front door burst open and Dorman bounded in, his cheeks flushed from running. Uncle Danny's at the dock, he announced. Says he's taking us to Spencer's for dinner and drinks. Margaret and Jack exchanged glances. Did he now? Margaret said carefully. Well, you'll need to wash up first. Dr. Parsons and his family will be here any minute. Can't they come too? Dorman asked, already halfway to the wash basin. I don't think, Jack began, but was interrupted by a firm knock at the door. Danny stood on the threshold, immaculately dressed in a suit that must have cost more than Jack earned in 3 months. He presented Margaret with a bouquet of flowers that looked distinctly non-local. Evening all, Danny beamed, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. For the loveliest woman in Newfoundland. Margaret accepted them with a tight smile. Thank you, Danny. We were just discussing dinner plans. Dr. Parsons and his family are joining us. Perfect. Invite them along. Me treat. Danny winked at Dorman. Dorman looked hopefully at Jack. Can we, doll? Jack felt cornered. We'll see. Another knock announced the arrival of Dr. Parsons, his wife, and their daughter Emily, who was Dorman's age and the source of his recent awkward attempts at combing his hair properly. The evening quickly took on a surreal quality as Danny charmed the Parsons family, insisted they all adjourn to Spencer's Tavern, and proceeded to order the most expensive items on the limited menu. Jack watched in mute frustration as his brother held court, spinning tales of his fishing adventures with just enough truth to be believable. The markets in Halifax are paying premium this season, Danny explained to Dr. Parsons, who nodded with feigned interest. If you knows da right buyers. Margaret caught Jack's eye across the table, her expression a clear warning, but Jack found himself watching the ease with which Danny moved through the world. How the tavern owner jumped to refill his glass, how Sarah Parsons laughed at his jokes, how even Dorman leaned forward to catch every word. Jack tried to remember the last time he'd seen his son look at him with such undisguised admiration. The thought left a bitter taste in his mouth. Dorman's respect meant everything to him. It was one of the few treasures Jack could still claim as his own. Would that change if the boy knew his father was considering breaking the law? Or would Dorman's eyes shine with that same excitement Danny inspired, seeing only the adventure and not the compromise? After the meal, while the others were distracted by dessert, Danny pulled Jack aside to the bar. What do you say, Jackie? Martell's waiting on an answer. Jack stared into his half-empty glass. It's not just me decision. Margaret would appreciate a new stove and not having to mend those curtains for the 50th time, Danny interrupted. You think I don't see how you're living? The patches on Dorm's trousers? Jack felt a flush of shame, followed quickly by anger. We manages. Managing isn't living, Danny countered. His voice softened. Look, I've been doing this long enough to know the safe routes. The Coast Guard keeps to their patterns. The Mounties are understaffed. One run to get you back on your feet. That's all I'm suggesting. Jack glanced back at their table. Margaret was deep in conversation with Sarah Parsons, but her posture was tense, one eye still on the brothers at the bar. When? Jack asked finally, the word tasting like surrender on his tongue. Danny's face lit up. 3 days, new moon, perfect cover. I'll arrange everything with Martel. He clasped Jack's shoulder. You're making the right choice, brother. This is just temporary, a means to an end. Jack nodded, already feeling the weight of the decision settling on him like a physical burden. One run, he emphasized. That's it. As they rejoined the table, Jack caught Margaret's questioning look. He gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, not ready to face her disappointment. Instead, he focused on Dorman, who was showing Emily his new penknife under the table. Their heads bent together conspiratorially. Later that night, after dropping a sleepy Dorman into bed, Jack finally told Margaret about his decision. They stood in their small bedroom, voices kept low. I won't pretend to understand, she said, her back to him as she unpinned her hair, but I knows what the alternative looks like. She turned to face him, eyes bright with unshed tears. Promise me it's just a once, Jack. Promise me you'll come back whole. Jack pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. I promise. One run to get us straight, then back to honest fishing. She nodded against his chest, but neither of them spoke further, the weight of the unspoken hanging between them like a storm cloud. After Jack went to check on Dorman, Margaret stood alone at the kitchen window, her hands gripping the sink's edge. 20 years of marriage had taught her to read the signs, the way Jack's shoulders set when he was wrestling with a decision, the careful tone when he mentioned Danny's alternative arrangements. She knew about Danny's trips to Saint Pierre. The whole town knew, even if they pretended otherwise. What frightened her wasn't the smuggling itself. Heaven knew half of Newfoundland had turned a blind eye to such things over the years. It was what it might do to Jack. Margaret had married Jack Keating precisely because he wasn't his father. Where Thomas had been volatile, Jack was steady. Where Thomas had made excuses, Jack took responsibility. She'd fallen in love with a man whose word meant something, whose integrity was worth more than any fortune. Now Danny was offering to corrupt that integrity for $800. The McAllister family had made their money from rum-running in the 20s. Now their fine house stood empty. The family scattered to the mainland after Robert McAllister died in prison, and his sons learned the price of easy money. Would the Keatings follow the same path? Margaret dried a plate slowly, her mind working through the calculations she'd been avoiding. The bills tucked behind the sugar tin, Dorman's boots with newspapers stuffed inside to cover the holes, the leak in the roof that grew worse with every storm, the medicine she needed but hadn't bought because the money went to fishing supplies instead. She thought of her sister in Port Basque, married to a merchant who'd never had to wonder where next month's rent would come from. The offer to help that Margaret had refused out of pride. Pride, was that all that stood between her family and security? After watching Jack wrestle with his demons, seeing the pain in his eyes when he looked at Dorman's patched clothes and their dwindling savings, Margaret came to her own decision. She turned to face him when he returned from tucking in their son. I went to see Mrs. O'Brien today, she said quietly. You know, Thomas O'Brien's widow. Jack frowned at the seeming change of subject. O'Brien had died the previous winter when his boat capsized in a storm, leaving 6 children and a widow, who now took in washing to survive. She showed me her hands, Margaret continued, cracked and bleeding from the lye soap, working 14 hours a day just to keep her children fed. And I thought, is that nobility? Is that what my pride is worth? She crossed to him, taking his face in her hands. I married an honest man, Jack Keating. I still want to be married to one when this is over. Can you promise me that? That this won't change who you are? I promise, Jack said, though even as the words left his mouth, he wondered if such a thing could be promised. Margaret studied his face for a long moment. Then I'll help you, not because I approve, but because I won't let you face this alone. That's what marriage means. Weathering the storms together, even the ones we bring upon ourselves. As she spoke, outlining the logistics with her characteristic efficiency, Jack felt a mixture of gratitude and shame. He corrupted not just himself, but Margaret too, drawing her into his web of compromise. Yet her willingness to share his burden, even while disapproving of it, struck him as the truest form of love he may have ever witnessed. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered after their planning was done, not sure if she was praying for the power to resist temptation or to accept it. Jack lay awake long after Margaret's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep. Through the small window, he could see stars scattered across the night sky, the same stars that had guided fishermen home for generations. His father had taught him their names, taught him to navigate by their patient light. "What would you think of me now, Dad?" Jack wondered. He could almost picture the old man's weathered face, the disappointed frown that would crease his brow at the thought of his son smuggling rum. But then, his father had never had to navigate these particular waters, had never watched the world change so rapidly beneath his feet, leaving him scrambling for purchase. Maybe there were no easy answers anymore. Maybe the best a man could do was choose the path that kept his family fed and his boat afloat, and hope that somewhere along the way, he'd find his way back to clearer conscience. With that uneasy thought, Jack finally drifted into fitful sleep, dreams of fog-shrouded waters and waiting patrol boats chasing him through the night. 3 days later, in the pre-dawn darkness, Jack slipped away from his sleeping house and made his way to the harbor. The new moon cast no light, leaving only the faint glow of stars to guide his path along the familiar route. His footsteps were muffled by the frost that coated everything in silver. The briny rose sat high in the water, freshly patched and fueled. Jack had spent the previous days preparing her meticulously, checking and rechecking the engine, the navigation lights, every system that might betray him at the wrong moment. Danny was waiting on the dock, a shadowy figure smoking a cigarette that glowed orange in the darkness. "Perfect conditions," Danny murmured as Jack approached. "Fog rolling in from the east. No Coast Guard scheduled for the southern route." Jack grunted non-committally, his stomach a tight knot. "Let's go over it again. Straight shot to Saint Pierre. Southern approach," Danny recited, drawing an invisible map with his cigarette. "Martel meets you at the eastern dock. Small operation, family-owned, no questions asked. Load the cargo, then back to rough the fog bank. If you're stopped, you're just coming back from the Grand Banks with engine trouble." "And if that don't work?" Danny shrugged. "Then I never saw you and you never saw me." At Jack's glare, he added, "Relax. Martel's people have the Mounties patrol schedules. You'll be fine." Jack climbed aboard the Brenny Rose, feeling the familiar sway beneath his feet. The boat seemed subtly different in this context. No longer just his livelihood, but an accomplice. "Remember," Danny called softly as Jack prepared to cast off, "hug the coastline until you clear Small Point, then straight south. Martel will have a light on the eastern dock. 3 flashes, then 2. Jack nodded, not trusting himself to speak. With practiced movements, he started the engine, which caught with a reassuring rumble. The vibration traveled up through his boots into his bones, the boat's heartbeat syncing with his own. As he guided the briny Rose away from the harbor, Jack tried not to look back at the sleeping town, at the dark window behind which Margaret and Dorman still slept, unaware of his departure. Better that way. No awkward goodbyes, no chance for last-minute doubts to take hold. The open water welcomed him as it always had, the familiar embrace of the Atlantic closing around the Rose like an old friend. Jack kept his eyes fixed on the compass, the course locked in his mind, south by southeast, toward the French islands and whatever waited for him there. Jack felt a strange sense of calm settling over him as the familiar coastline receded, Out here, he knew who he was, a sailor reading wind and wave, a man in his element. The moral quagmire of his decision seemed to dissolve in the salt spray. For now there was only the sea and the task before him. He was always in his comfort zone out here on the North Atlantic, regardless of the conditions. The fog Danny had promised materialized as dawn broke, a gray wall rising from the sea. Jack steered into it gratefully, letting the mist swallow the briny rose whole. 10 miles out, as the sun struggled to penetrate the fog blanket, Jack spotted something that made his blood run cold. The distinctive silhouette of a government vessel, idling where no patrol should be. He cut his engine speed instinctively, letting the Rose drift forward on minimal power. The patrol boat was stationed just inside Canadian waters, its outline blurred by distance and fog but unmistakable. Coast Guard or Mounties, it didn't matter. Neither meant good news for a man on Jack's errand. Jack held his breath as he watched the vessel through his binoculars. It wasn't moving, just sitting there like a spider in its web, waiting. For a long moment, Jack considered turning back. It would be the sensible thing, the safe thing. But the thought of facing Danny's disappointment, of returning to Margaret empty-handed after promising a solution to their troubles. Jack adjusted his course slightly, plotting a wider arc that would take him farther east before turning south again. It would add hours to his journey, but might keep him clear of the patrol sightline. As he eased the briny Rose into the new heading, the fog thickened further until the world narrowed to a small circle of gray water around his boat. Jack switched on his navigation lights despite the risk. Better to be seen by a patrol than run aground on hidden shoals. With visibility reduced to nearly nothing, Jack relied on instruments and memory to guide him toward the French islands and the rendezvous that might change everything, for better or worse. Behind him, Bergio disappeared completely, swallowed by fog and distance. Ahead lay Saint Pierre and Miquelon, where Louis Martel waited with barrels of contraband and promises of prosperity. And somewhere in between, watching from the mist, the shadow of authority hovered, a reminder that the line between salvation and ruin was as thin and shifting as the fog itself. Chapter 2. The Trouble. Saint Pierre materialized from the fog like a smudged watercolor, its harbor lights glimmering faintly through the gray veil. Jack had visited the French islands only twice before, once as a boy with his father to deliver saltfish, and again on his honeymoon, when he'd splurged on a bottle of real French wine to impress Margaret. Now he approached as a stranger, with a secret purpose. Unlike Bergio's weathered fishing stages and modest saltbox houses, Saint Pierre's waterfront displayed its European heritage proudly. Colorful buildings in red, yellow, and blue lined the harbor, their distinctive mansard roofs and wooden balconies standing in stark contrast to the utilitarian structures of Newfoundland's outports. Despite being less than 50 miles from Canadian shores, this was France in miniature. The tricolor flag snapping in the October wind, street signs in French, and not a Mountie in sight. Jack cut the briny Rose's engine to a low idle, scanning the eastern docks. Danny's instructions echoed in his mind. 3 flashes, then 2. For several tense minutes, he saw nothing but the steady lights of the harbor. Then, there, a pinprick of brightness winked out, then flashed again in the pattern he'd been told to expect. Jack guided the briny Rose toward the signal with practiced caution, keeping his running lights low. As he drew closer, he could make out the silhouette of a small dock extending from what appeared to be a fisherman's shed, set apart from the main harbor operations. A solitary figure waited at its edge, hands clasped behind his back. "Monsieur Keating?" The voice carried softly over the water as Jack brought the Rose alongside. "Louis Martel. Your brother spoke highly of your discretion." Martel was a compact man, perhaps 50, with a neatly trimmed beard that gave him the look of a sea captain from an old painting. The gold tooth Danny had mentioned caught the meager light when he smiled. His English carried the distinct cadence of the French islands. Not quite Canadian, not quite European. "Let's get this over with," Jack replied, securing his vessel to the dock with quick, efficient movements. Martel smiled, fingers adjusting the lapel of his jacket, which even Jack could tell was of finer quality than anything available in Burgeo. "Your brother, he is more enthusiastic about our business arrangement." "Me brother talks too much," Jack said, his voice tight with impatience. "I'm here for one run. That's all." "Of course," Martel gestured toward the shed. "The cargo is prepared. 100 tins, 2 gallons each. No labels, nothing to trace them back to Saint Pierre. Much easier to handle than barrels, no? And less suspicious should anyone become too curious." Inside the shed, stacks of plain metal tins lined the walls, their unmarked surfaces dully reflecting the lantern light. When Martel unscrewed the cap from one to show Jack, the unmistakable aroma filled the small space, rich and pungent. The scent of rum had always preceded violence in the Keating household, a warning sign as reliable as storm clouds before a gale. Jack had learned early to recognize the signs. The familiar bottle from Spencer's Tavern, now owned by the son of the man who had served Jack's father decades earlier, clutched in Thomas Keating's weathered hand. Jack took an involuntary step back, his stomach churning. "From Martinique," Martel explained, oblivious to Jack's reaction. He offered Jack a small cup with a sample. "The finest in the Caribbean. Your Canadian friends pay extraordinary prices for such quality, especially with your restrictive laws." Jack stared at the amber liquid in the cup, remembering the countless mornings he'd found his father unconscious at the kitchen table, an empty bottle beside him. The fishing days lost to hangovers, the money squandered at Spencer's father's tavern, the constant cycle of promising to quit and failing spectacularly. Worst were the violent nights, when Thomas's mood turned from jovial to thunderous in the space of a glass, when belts came off and fists flew. Jack had learned early to step between his father and Danny, to take the blows meant for his younger brother. The dislocated shoulder at 14, the cracked ribs at 16, the time Thomas had pushed him down the stairs and Jack had lain there, certain his back was broken. "Not interested," Jack said quietly, turning away from the offered cup. Jack felt sick inside. After swearing he'd never touch the poison that had nearly destroyed his family, here he was, trafficking in it. Martel shrugged and downed the rum himself. "Business only, I respect this. But remember, Monsieur Keating, the best smugglers are those who appear to be exactly what they claim. A fisherman who does not know his cargo raises suspicion." The Frenchman's words settled uneasily on Jack's shoulders as they began the laborious process of loading the tins onto the briny rows. Each one weighed over 15 pounds, and the work of moving 100 of them left Jack sweating despite the cool October air. Martel helped without complaint, his wiry frame belying surprising strength. The tin containers clinked as they were stacked in the Rose's hold, a sound that would soon become unnervingly familiar to Jack. Though he'd initially worried about their visibility, the stacks of gleaming metal disappeared beneath canvas tarps, transforming into what could plausibly be supplies for an extended fishing expedition. As they secured the last tin, Martel handed Jack a small envelope. "Half now, as agreed with your brother, the rest upon delivery." Jack pocketed the envelope without looking inside. The less he knew about its contents, the easier it would be to forget this night once it was over. "One last thing," Martel said as Jack prepared to cast off, glancing around as if the empty harbor might have ears. "Keep this run quiet, yes? We have competing interests in Burgeo now, and information. It travels in unfortunate ways sometimes." Before Jack could question this cryptic warning, Martel had slipped away into the fog, leaving only the faint scent of cologne and tobacco in his wake. The return journey began smoothly enough. Jack plotted a northeasterly course, planning to swing wide around the fishing grounds where other Burgeo boats might be working. The fog had thickened again, providing welcome cover as the Rose, riding noticeably low in the water now with its illicit cargo, pushed steadily through the gray morning. Jack found himself constantly scanning the horizon, every distant shape transformed by his guilty conscience into a potential Coast Guard vessel. The weight of what he carried seemed to press down on him more heavily than the physical cargo, a moral burden that the $400 in his pocket couldn't offset. As the waves slapped rhythmically against the hull, Jack found himself drowning in memories of his father that he'd spent decades trying to suppress. Thomas Keating was a multifaceted individual within the village. He was esteemed for his proficiency as a fisherman during his sober moments, but he elicited both sympathy and apprehension when he succumbed to alcohol, which was quite often. The drinking had begun as occasional indulgence, then expanded to include reasons to celebrate, then any day they returned from a good catch. Eventually it became most days, with only brief periods of sobriety when money ran out, or when some crisis temporarily shocked Thomas into temperance. The Keating curse, so some called it, referring to the family's generations-long battle with the bottle. Jack's grandfather had drunk himself to death before Jack was born. His uncle William had followed the same path. Jack had spent his youth terrified that the same weakness flowed in his veins, that one drink would set him on the inevitable slide into becoming his father. He'd been careful, so careful, allowing himself only the occasional glass of beer at celebrations, never spirits, never enough to feel more than slightly warm. And now here he was, with 100 tins of contraband rum in his hold, participating in the very trade that had helped destroy his father. Thomas had been dead 5 years now, his liver finally surrendering after decades of abuse. In his final year, sober by necessity rather than choice, he'd tried to make amends. "I wasn't me when I hurt you boys," he'd insisted from his sickbed. "It was the devil's water doing the talking." But Jack knew better. The alcohol hadn't created the violence in his father. It had merely given it permission to emerge. 3 hours out from Saint Pierre, with the Newfoundland coast still invisible beyond the fog bank, a sudden metallic groan from the engine room sent Jack scrambling below deck. The familiar smell of hot oil and diesel gave way to something sharper, burned wiring. In the dim light, he could see smoke wisping from beneath the engine casing. "Sweet Jesus," he muttered, yanking the cover free. The sight beneath confirmed his worst fears. A fuel line had split, spraying diesel onto the hot manifold. Worse, the connection to the cooling system appeared to have been loosened, causing the engine to run dangerously hot. Jack examined the damage more closely, his experienced eyes quickly recognizing that this was no ordinary mechanical failure. The fuel line hadn't worn through. It had been cut, a clean, precise slice, as if done with a sharp knife, and the cooling system connections showed tool marks where they'd been deliberately loosened. Someone had tampered with his engine, recently, and with deliberate intent. Jack shut down the engine before it could seize entirely, but the damage was done. The briny Rose now drifted powerless in open water, with 100 tins of contraband rum in her hold, and no way to explain them if discovered. For the first time since leaving Burgeo, real fear gripped Jack's heart, not the nervous caution he'd felt approaching Saint Pierre, but cold, genuine terror. He was trapped, a sitting duck for any passing patrol, with evidence that would send him to prison for years. Margaret's face flashed through his mind, the look she would wear when they came to tell her they'd arrested her husband. Then Dorman, suddenly the man of the house at 13, trying to work the Rose alone, or worse, forced to sell it to cover their debts. Would his son grow up visiting his father in prison, the way Jack had once visited his own father in the county jail after particularly destructive benders? Jack forced these thoughts away. Panic would solve nothing. With mechanical determination, he inspected the damage further, identifying what he could repair and what was beyond salvaging. The fuel line he could patch temporarily with electrical tape from the emergency kit, but the cooling system needed replacement parts he didn't have. As he worked in the cramped engine compartment, a more pressing concern gnawed at him. The 100 tins of contraband rum in his hold. If he was discovered dead in the water like this, there'd be no explaining them away. The image of Margaret visiting him in prison flashed through his mind, followed by Dorman trying to work the rows alone at 13. "Think, Jack," he muttered to himself. "Think like your grandfather would have." His grandfather, the original owner of the briny rows, had been a shrewd man who'd survived decades of hard fishing by being prepared for anything, including competition from other fishermen who weren't above stealing a good catch if given the chance. Jack's eyes fell on a section of the hull that looked no different from any other. Worn planking stained with years of salt spray and fish oil. But he knew better. 6 years ago, after the McPhersons had helped themselves to half his lobster haul while he was ashore, Jack had spent a winter creating something his grandfather would have approved of. A hidden compartment built into the very bones of the rows. Moving with desperate efficiency, aware that every minute increased his chances of discovery, Jack began transferring tins from the main hold to the hidden compartment. He located the brass nail head that served as the hidden mechanism. To any observer, it appeared to be just another piece of hardware holding the planks in place, its head worn smooth by years of weather. But when pressed twice in quick succession, it released a catch that allowed a section of the inner hull to slide sideways on hidden runners. The compartment behind the sliding panel was substantial, but not unlimited in capacity. Jack had sacrificed some storage space to create it, building it where the hull curved to maximize room without being obvious from outside. He designed it years ago to hide valuable catches, never imagining he'd need to conceal this many tins. Jack tested the compartment's size against his dilemma. The space could hold around 50 tins if carefully stacked, half his illicit cargo. The other 50 would have to remain in the main hold, vulnerable to discovery. As he worked, Jack's mind raced through scenarios. If spotted by the Coast Guard, he might be able to explain away 50 tins as personal stores. Excessive perhaps, but not clearly commercial quantity. The hidden half would be his insurance. With painstaking care, Jack began transferring tins to the secret hold, his back protesting the awkward angle required to reach deep into the compartment. Each tin had to be positioned precisely to maximize the space. He counted as he worked, 25, 30, 40. The compartment filled more quickly than he'd hoped. 5 more, he muttered, forcing himself to work methodically despite his growing anxiety. As he approached 50, the compartment was nearly overflowing. Jack had to remove several tins and rearrange the entire stack, fitting them at precise angles against the curved hull. With careful placement of the final tin, he managed to squeeze in all 50, though the panel now required extra pressure to close properly. Every available inch of space had been utilized. Jack slid the panel closed, watching as it became invisible again. Just another section of weathered planking. Unless someone knew exactly where to look and how to operate it, those 50 tins might as well not exist. The remaining 50 tins would have to stay in the main hold, covered with tarps and fishing gear, a partial disguise at best. If boarded and searched, Jack's only hope lay in convincing authorities that the visible cargo was for personal use, a claim thin as ice in spring thaw. With the most damaging evidence hidden and temporary repairs complete, Jack managed to coax the engine back to life, though it coughed and sputtered in a way that told him it wouldn't last long. Jack plotted the shortest course to Burgeo, abandoning caution for necessity. If he could get within radio range of the harbor before the engine failed completely, he might be able to call for a tow without explaining his cargo. Fate, it seemed, had other plans. Barely 30 minutes later, with the engine knocking ominously, the radio crackled to life. East of Burgeo, approximately 20 miles out. Danny's voice, strained with unusual tension, broke through the static. Repeat, requesting assistance for the Queen's Bounty, experiencing navigation issues in heavy fog. Jack grabbed the handset. Danny, it's Jack. What's your position? A long pause followed, then, Jackie? Where the hell are you? Thought you were headed to Dia fishing grounds near Fortune Bay. The lie in Danny's words was obvious. They both knew exactly where Jack had been, but the radio channel was open, potentially monitored by other vessels or the Coast Guard station at Porto Basque. Engine trouble, Jack replied, matching Danny's careful tone. Limping back, but don't think she'll make it. Can you assist? Another pause, longer this time. Give me your coordinates. I'll change course. Jack relayed his position, then shut down the sputtering engine to preserve what little function it had left. The silence that followed was profound. Only the gentle slap of waves against the hull and the distant cry of gulls broke the morning stillness. An hour later, the Queen's Bounty emerged from the fog like a ghost ship, its polished hull gleaming even in the diffuse light. Danny worked quickly and silently, securing a tow line between the vessels. It wasn't until they were underway, the briny Rose trailing behind Danny's boat like a reluctant child, that the brothers spoke face to face. Someone has tampered with my engine, Jack stated directly as Danny helped him aboard the Queen's Bounty. He described the cut fuel line and loosened cooling system connections. Danny's expression remained carefully neutral. I was out looking for you. I had a feeling something was wrong. I was pretending I was in trouble, hoping you'd hear me. Danny continued with a confused look in his eye. Sabotage, Jackie, you sure? A lot of things can go wrong with an old engine, Jackie. Don't play the fool. The fuel line was cut. Clean slice, not wear and tear, Jack said, his voice edged with frustration. Jack stepped closer, studying his brother's face. You know something about this? A flicker of unease crossed Danny's features. I told you Martel's operation was getting competitive. Might be someone didn't appreciate a new boat on the route. Or maybe Martel himself arranged a little insurance policy, Jack countered, anger rising to displace his fear. Make sure I can't just take his goods and disappear. Danny shook his head. Martel's careful, but he's not stupid. What good is a supplier with no way to deliver? No, this is someone else. He hesitated, then added, There's been talk round to Halifax docks. Mainlanders moving in on the rum trade, cutting out local runners. Big money involved now. The kind of thing you might have mentioned before sending me out there, Jack voiced, his anger growing. Would you have gone if I had? Asked Danny. There's something else, Danny said, glancing nervously around, as if the open ocean might have ears. Been seeing a boat I don't recognize. Black hull, no markings, anchors off small point for hours, then disappears. Coast Guard, Jack asked, though his gut told him otherwise. Maybe, or maybe competition. Danny's usual confidence seemed fractured. Martel warned me there were others interested in this route. Mainland syndicates that don't like locals cutting into their business. Jack studied his brother's face, seeing for the first time the toll his lifestyle was taking. Dark circles under his eyes, a nervous tick in his jaw that hadn't been there before. The easy money wasn't so easy after all. You could stop, Jack suggested quietly. Walk away before... Before what? Danny laughed, but there was no humor in it. Before they put a bullet in me? Before the Mounties catch up? I'm in too deep now, Jackie. The only way out is to rough. The fatalism in his voice chilled Jack more than any threat could have. This wasn't the cocky, confident Danny he'd always known. This was a man who'd already accepted his fate. Jack didn't answer. They both knew he wouldn't have, and that Danny had counted on exactly that. The realization settled like a stone in his gut. His own brother had manipulated him, knowing precisely which buttons to push: family, pride, financial desperation. Danny had always been the smoother talker of the two, even as children. When their father was on a tear, it was Danny who could sometimes talk him down, redirect his rage with a joke or a compliment. Jack had admired that skill then. Now he recognized it as something more calculating. "How do we get into Burgeo without raising questions?" Jack asked instead, swallowing his anger. "Rose is riding low with those tins, and now she's being towed in broad daylight." Danny smiled thinly. "We'll bring her in. Say I found you drifting when I were coming back from me own trip. We'll unload at McAllister's old stage. No one uses it since he passed. Maybe no one will even notice." Jack nodded slowly. It might work. "And then what?" Jack asked. "The tins can't stay on me boat." "We'll need to hide them someplace nobody would look," Danny said. "At least until me pickup man arrives from Nord Sydney next week." Jack weighed their limited options. Every fishing shed in Burgeo was used regularly. There were no abandoned buildings secluded enough to safely store 50 tins of illegal rum. And Danny's place would be the first spot the Mounties would search if they got suspicious. "I've got 50 of them in a secret compartment I built into the Rose," Jack said quietly. "But the other 50 need somewhere safe until your pickup man comes." Danny's eyebrows rose. "Secret compartment?" "On the Rose. Built it 6 years ago after the McPhersons tried to steal our lobster catch. Hidden hole beneath the main compartment. Even if they search the boat, they won't find it unless they know exactly where to look." "Smart," Danny nodded approvingly. "And the other 50? The brothers fell silent as they guided the vessel slowly through the fog, each lost in his own thoughts. Jack found himself running through the possible consequences of the day's events. If they were caught now, it would be impossible to claim ignorance. The 50 tins might be unmarked, but their contents were unmistakable. Smuggling charges would follow, likely prison time. But if they succeeded, Jack felt the weight of the envelope with his payment, enough to repair the briny Rose properly, to buy Dorman new boots and school supplies, to see Margaret's relief when the bills were paid without selling another family heirloom. When had honest fishing stopped being enough? Had it ever been? His father, for all his failings, had at least been transparent in his weaknesses. Thomas Keating had never pretended to be anything other than what he was, a skilled fisherman battling demons he couldn't defeat. His sins had been committed openly, visible to all of Burgeo in his staggering walk and bloodshot eyes. Jack's transgression felt worse somehow, calculated, hidden, a deliberate choice rather than a compulsion. Would Dorman someday look at him with the same mixture of love, fear, and disappointment that Jack had felt toward his own father? These questions circled like hungry gulls as the fog began to thin, revealing the familiar outline of the Burgeo coastline in the distance. From his perch on Barter's Rock, Dorman Keating searched the misty horizon for signs of the briny Rose. The outcropping, named for one of Burgeo's founding families, provided the best view of the returning fishing boats, and he'd been watching for nearly an hour with his friend Emily Parsons. "Where do you suppose your father's got to now?" Emily asked, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. The October wind had picked up, carrying the first real bite of winter. "Probably just running late," Dorman replied, though he couldn't keep the worry from his voice. His father was never late, not without radioing ahead. Emily tossed a pebble down the rocky slope. "My father says your Daw's the most reliable fisherman in Burgeo. Says he wishes other men were as punctual with their doctor bills." Dorman smiled despite his concern. It was true. Jack Keating prided himself on promptness, on keeping his word. which made his current absence even more unsettling. "What's that?" Emily suddenly pointed toward the harbor entrance, where a vessel was emerging from the afternoon fog. Dorman's heart jumped, then fell. "That's the Queen's Bounty, Uncle Danny's boat." "There's something behind it," Emily said, squinting against the pale sunlight. "Being towed, I think." Dorman scrambled to his feet, shading his eyes against the wan sunlight. Sure enough, the briny Rose was trailing behind Danny's vessel. "It's the briny Rose," he confirmed, relief and fresh worry battling within him. "Something's wrong. They wouldn't be towing her otherwise." As they watched, the two boats bypassed the main harbor, instead angling toward a small cove where Tobias McAllister's abandoned fishing stage stood, a weathered structure that had once been used for cleaning and salting cod before the old man's death the previous winter. "Why aren't they going to the main dock?" Emily wondered aloud. Dorman frowned, remembering fragments of conversation he'd overheard between his father and Uncle Danny a few days before. Something about fishing grounds and good money and whispers of that place Saint Pierre. His hand rubbed the pearl handle of the penknife he always kept on him now. "Maybe the Rose's engine is damaged," he suggested, though the explanation felt insufficient even to his own ears. "We should go see if Daw needs help." But as they rose to leave, movement at the government wharf caught their attention. The distinctive white hull of a mounted police patrol boat cutting through the afternoon haze. "Look," Emily said, nudging Dorman. "The Mounties." "What are they doing here?" Dorman asked, voicing the question that had immediately sprung to Emily's mind as well. "Don't know. They don't come to Burgeo much." They watched as the patrol boat docked and two officers in the distinctive uniform of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police disembarked. One was a stranger, but the other Emily recognized immediately. "That's Constable Griggs," she said. "He was assigned to De Burgeo Post last winter. My father treats his young'uns." Dorman felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Mounties arriving on the same day his father's boat was being towed to an isolated location? It couldn't be coincidence. "I needs to go," he said abruptly, already scrambling down from their perch. "Mum will be worried about my Donnie." Emily grabbed his arm. "Wait, Darm. What's going on? You know sometime, don't you?" Dorman hesitated, torn between loyalty to his family and his friendship with Emily. "I'm not sure," he said finally, "but I think Da might be in trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind you don't talk about." Dorman gently pulled free of her grip. "I have to go, Em." She studied his face, then nodded slowly. "Be careful, Darm. And let me know if I can help, all right?" Dorman managed a tight smile before hurrying down the path toward home, his mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. Margaret Keating had been keeping watch at her kitchen window for hours, counting the fishing boats returning to harbor and growing increasingly tense as the briny Rose remained conspicuously absent. Jack had told her it would be a 2-day trip to and from Saint Pierre, 3 at most. This was the afternoon of the 3rd day, and still no sign of him. The sound of running footsteps on the path drew her attention. Dorman burst through the door, breathless and wide-eyed. "The Mounties are in town," he blurted, "and Daw's boat is being towed by Uncle Danny to McAllister's old stage." Margaret's hands stilled on the dough she'd been kneading, flour dusting her forearms like snow. Her expression shifted from surprise to something closer to grim confirmation. "Did they speak to you, Dorman?" she asked calmly, though her heart hammered in her chest. "No, I saw them from Barter's Rock with Emily. We watched Uncle Danny towing the Rose, and the Mounties have just arrived on their patrol boat." The words tumbled out in a rush. "What's going on? Is Da in trouble?" Margaret wiped her hands slowly on her apron, buying time to compose her thoughts. Her son was 13 now, not a child anymore, but not yet a man either. How much should she tell him? How much could she protect him from? Your father may have gotten involved in something complicated, she said carefully. Something to help with our expenses. Dorman's eyes narrowed with sudden understanding. The rumors about Uncle Danny, about Saint Pierre rum, they're true, aren't they? And now Da's part of it. Margaret shouldn't have been surprised by her son's perceptiveness, but it still caught her off guard. Dorman, listen to me. Whatever's happening, your father is a good man who only wants what's best for us. Do you understand? The boy nodded slowly, his young face suddenly grave with adult concerns. What do we do now? Before Margaret could answer, a soft knock came at the back door. She exchanged an alarmed glance with Dorman before crossing the kitchen to open it. Jack stood there, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Behind him, dusk was settling over Burgio, the lights of the village beginning to wink on one by one. Jack, Margaret breathed, relief flooding through her. She pulled him inside, closing the door quickly behind him. What happened? Dorman says the Rose is being towed. Engine sabotage, Jack replied, embracing his son with one arm while keeping his voice low. Someone tampered with the fuel line and cooling system. Danny found me drifting. It's not as bad as I first thought it was. I think I can fix it when I can get at it with some tools at the dock. And that there cargo? Margaret asked, carefully choosing her words, though it was clear Dorman had already guessed the truth. I managed to hide 50 tins in the secret compartment I built into the Rose years ago, Jack said, glancing meaningfully at Dorman. The other 50 are still in the main hold. Danny secured the Rose at McAllister's old stage. But Dom Mounties are in town. Constable Griggs and another officer from Port Aux Basques. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. They know. Not yet, but they're asking questions about boats going to Saint Pierre. Jack ran a hand through his salt-stiffened hair. Danny thinks we should move to 50 tins tonight. Find a hiding place until his buyer arrives from North Sydney next week. Where? Every shed in Burgio is used regular, and if they search the Rose, they'll find nothing in the secret hold, Jack assured her. But we need somewhere for the other 50. Margaret's practical mind began working through possibilities, even as another part of her reeled at the reality of their situation. Jack Keating, her steady, reliable, honest Jack, was now a rum smuggler, and they were discussing where to hide contraband with their 13-year-old son standing right there. Dorman, she said suddenly, turning to the boy who'd been listening intently to their exchange. Go to your room and start on your arithmetic. Your father and I need to talk privately. But Mum? Now, Dorman. Her tone brooked no argument. With obvious reluctance, Dorman trudged up the narrow staircase, his footsteps deliberately heavy on the wooden treads. Once they heard his bedroom door close, Margaret turned back to Jack. I think he already knows everything, Jackie. Margaret nodded. Aye, but he doesn't need to hear us plan every step. The hollow space under the stairs, she said in a low voice. We could hide them there. Jack stared at her. In our home, Maggie? 50 tins? Where else? Margaret countered pragmatically. They'll search your boat first thing tomorrow, that's certain. They might even check Danny's place, but they'd need a warrant to search our house. And who would think to look under our stairs? Jack considered this. 3 summers ago, their neighbor Eli had helped Jack repair the floor and discovered a hollow space beneath the staircase. Not a proper room, more of a void in the construction that had never been properly closed up. They'd replaced the floorboards but never bothered to seal off the space properly. It could work, he admitted reluctantly. But 50 tins, Margaret? In our home, if they're found. A week, you said, just until Danny's buyer comes. She reached across the table, taking his rough hands in hers. And remember, 50 are already safely hidden in the Rose's secret compartment, so we're only dealing with 50 here at home. Jack squeezed her hands, gratitude and shame mingling in his expression. I'm sorry, Maggie. For all of this, save your apologies for when it's over, she replied, not unkindly. Right now, we need to act normal. Eat dinner, talk about everyday things. If the Mounties are watching, they'll notice anything out of the ordinary. Jack nodded, appreciating once again his wife's practical strength. While he had been panicking on the open water, Margaret had been mentally preparing for the worst, ready with solutions when they were needed most. I'll wash up, he said, rising stiffly. His muscles ached from the hours of tension and emergency repairs. Then we'll have a normal family dinner, like nothing's wrong. As if anything could be normal again, he thought, climbing the stairs to change. As if they hadn't just agreed to transform their home into a smuggler's storehouse with 50 tins of contraband rum from Saint Pierre. Constable Albert Griggs had never particularly wanted a posting in Burgeo. After serving in Europe during the war, he'd hoped for assignment to a larger center, St. John's perhaps, or even back to his native Halifax. Instead, the RCMP had sent him to this remote fishing outpost, where the locals regarded mainland authority with thinly veiled suspicion. 3 years after Newfoundland's union with Canada, many here still considered themselves Newfoundlanders first, viewing their new Canadian identity as an unwelcome imposition. Griggs had learned to navigate these sentiments carefully, building relationships where he could, and avoiding heavy-handed enforcement of regulations the locals found nonsensical. But smuggling was different. The influx of untaxed liquor and tobacco undermined legitimate businesses and funneled money to criminal organizations on the mainland. When reports from Halifax indicated that Saint Pierre had become a pipeline for contraband entering Canada, with Burgeo high on the list of likely transfer points, Griggs had requested assistance. Not exactly forthcoming were they, Constable Victor Bateman observed as they left Spencer's Tavern after talking with several patrons. The younger officer had arrived that morning from Port aux Basques to assist with the investigation. Did you expect them to be? Griggs replied, adjusting his uniform coat against the evening chill. Half of them are probably customers, the other half relatives of whoever's running the operation. They walked along the harbor front, ostensibly conducting a routine patrol, but actually taking note of which boats were present and which were conspicuously absent. The setting sun cast long shadows across the weathered docks, fishing stages, and flakes where cod was traditionally dried. Structures that had defined Newfoundland's outport communities for centuries. The Keating brothers, Bateman mused. Your primary suspects? Daniel Keating for certain, Griggs confirmed. New boat, frequent trips to fishing grounds that yield no visible catch, sudden prosperity, classic signs. And the brother? Jack? Asked Bateman. Griggs frowned slightly. Less certain there. Jack Keating's got a reputation as a straight arrow, church-going, family man, works hard. But his boat's been getting repairs it shouldn't be able to afford, and he's been spotted with Daniel more frequently these past weeks. Family loyalty can be a powerful motivator, Bateman noted. Indeed, and financial necessity an even stronger one, Griggs added. Griggs had been in Burgeo long enough to understand the economic pressures facing the local fishermen. The transition to Canadian fishing regulations had been particularly hard on the small operators, with new quotas and reporting requirements adding complexity to an already precarious livelihood. Most fishermen in Burgeo had limited formal education, making government paperwork a significant challenge. But living amongst the people of Burgeo had taught Griggs much about their resilience and resourcefulness. Though hard-pressed economically, especially since Confederation, these were intelligent, ingenious people who had survived for generations in one of North America's harshest environments. He also knew about the Keating family history. Thomas Keating had been notorious in Burgeo, a skilled fisherman but a violent alcoholic whose binges had frequently landed him in the local lockup. More than once, Griggs's predecessor had intervened in domestic disturbances at the Keating household. The old man had finally drunk himself to death a few years back, but such family patterns often repeated themselves in subtle ways. They continued their circuit, eventually making their way to the eastern edge of the harbor, where a cluster of older fishing boats bobbed gently at their moorings. Griggs noted with interest that the briny Rose was missing from her usual spot, and also was missing from the dock was Danny Keating's vessel, the Queen's Bounty. "The Keating brothers' boats are still out," Griggs observed quietly. "Could be fishing." "That's what they'll claim. No one else seems to be out fishing. Seems odd." Griggs shook his head. Something's off." A local fisherman, Edwin Baggs, approached the dock, a coil of rope over his shoulder. Griggs hailed him casually. "Evening, Mr. Baggs. Seen Jack Keating today?" asked Griggs. "Jack?" Baggs considered, then shook his head. "Not since yesterday. His brother was saying something about engine trouble, though. Tink Danny went to give him a tow." "Whereabouts?" Baggs shrugged. "Didn't say exact. Somewhere off Fortune Bay, I suppose. That's where Jack said he was headed." Griggs thanked the man, then turned to Bateman once Baggs was out of earshot. "So either Jack Keating is legitimately fishing and having engine problems, or it's a convenient cover story." Griggs pulled his coat tighter against the rising wind. "I think we need to expand our search area. Tonight we'll check all the coves and inlets within a mile of town. If contraband is coming ashore, it's likely at an isolated spot." Now, with their son finally upstairs in bed, Jack and Margaret prepared for the night's dangerous work. "We'll need to make 2 trips," Jack whispered, checking the handcart's wheels to ensure they wouldn't squeak. 25 tins each time should be manageable." Margaret nodded, wrapping each tin in old dish towels to prevent them from clinking together during transport. The night had grown bitterly cold, the autumn sky clear and star-filled, perfect for visibility, terrible for covert operations. "We'll need to be quick," she murmured. "Take the path behind Turner's property. It's darker there, fewer windows overlooking." Jack marveled again at his wife's practical approach to their predicament. While he'd been paralyzed by guilt and fear, Margaret had transformed into a skilled accomplice, thinking through every detail of their illicit enterprise. "Ready?" he asked, loading the first batch of wrapped tins onto the cart. Margaret pulled a dark shawl over her hair and nodded. "I'll go ahead. Make sure Daway is clear." The first journey was nerve-wracking. Every shadow seemed to harbor a watching Mountie. Every creak of the cart's wheels sounded to Jack's guilty ears like an alarm. They moved in stages, Margaret scouting ahead, her footsteps silent on the frost-covered path, signaling when it was safe for Jack to follow with the heavily laden cart. McAllister's stage, where the briny Rose was docked, sat alone in a small cove away from the main harbor, accessible by land through a narrow path that wound along the rocky shoreline. The weathered structure creaked in the night wind, its salt-stained boards silvered by decades of exposure to sea spray and sun. They were midway through their second trip when Jack's back seized painfully. He stopped abruptly, the cart handle slipping from his grasp as he pressed a hand against his lower spine. "What is it?" Margaret whispered. "Me back," Jack grunted, teeth clenched against the pain. "Dat old injury from de fishing accident last spring." He tried to straighten, but another spasm doubled him over. Margaret steadied him, concern in her eyes. "Can you make it back to the house? We needs to rest." Jack shook his head grimly. "No time. I got to get dose tins out of the briny Rose before morning. Does friggin' Mouties, we got to get them off before they come prowling round. Somewhere safe. Danny's pickup man could arrive any day, or it might be next week. We needs them tins out of her by dawn." "You'll do no good if you can't stand straight," Margaret countered. Then after a moment's hesitation, "We needs help, Jack." "Who? Can't trust anyone in town with dis." Jack grimaced as another wave of pain shot through his spine. Margaret's expression was resolute in the darkness. "Not anyone. Dorman." "No," Jack said immediately. "Not our boy, not in dis." "He already knows, Jack," Margaret pointed out. "He's strong for his age and careful, and he's your son. You've taught him well." Jack wanted to protest further, but another shooting pain silenced him. Margaret was right. They couldn't manage this alone, not with his back giving out and time running against them. "All right," he conceded reluctantly, "but we don't tell him more than he needs to know." By the time they reached the house, Jack could barely walk upright. Margaret helped him inside, then went upstairs to wake their son. Dorman appeared in the kitchen moments later, his hair tousled from sleep but his eyes alert. He took one look at his father's hunched posture and understood immediately. "Your back's gone out again," he observed. Jack nodded, embarrassed to be seen in such a state. "Dorm, we need your help with something important, something dangerous." "The rum tins," Dorman said simply. Both parents stared at him. "I'm not stupid. I figured it out." Jack and Margaret exchanged glances. There was no point in pretense now. "We're moving 50 of them to the house," Jack explained. "Tonight, unloaded from the rows." Dorman nodded, listening intently. Jack continued. "Danny says his buyer is coming next week. The 50 tins will go to him. But tonight we need to hide them under our stairs. There's 50 more already hidden in a secret compartment on the rows that no one knows about. And you need me to help with the handcart," Dorman concluded. "It's dangerous, Dorman," Margaret warned. "If the Mounties catch us—" "I want to help," Dorman interrupted, a surprising determination in his young face. "Tell me what to do." Margaret returned with a warm poultice, helping Jack position it against his lower back. "The hollow space under the stairs," she explained to Dorman, seeing his confusion. "It's where we're planning to hide them until Danny's buyer comes." "There's a space under our stairs?" Dorman asked, surprised. "More like a gap in the construction," Jack clarified. "Old Man Coyne wasn't much for precision when he built these houses. Left gaps all over. Eli Tucker helped me find it when we repaired the floor to Summers back." Dorman listened intently as his father explained how they would access the hidden space and transfer the 50 tins from the rows to the space under the stairs. It was strange, he thought, to be included in this adult conspiracy. Frightening, but also oddly thrilling. And so, for the remainder of the night, the Keating family worked as a unit, moving the contraband from the briny rows to their home. Jack supervised, his expertise guiding them even as pain kept him from the heaviest labor. Margaret scouted the path, ensuring their movements went undetected. And Dorman proved himself surprisingly capable, handling the heavy tins with careful efficiency. By the time they finished their final trip, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. All 50 tins now sat safely hidden in the hollow space, waiting for Danny's buyer or pickup man to arrive the next week. "What now?" Dorman asked as they returned home, exhausted but successful. "Now we wait," Jack replied. "Danny's pickup man comes next week, takes the shipment, and the worst of this nightmare ends." But even as he spoke the words, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were just beginning. "You did good work tonight, Dorm," Jack said quietly. "I'm sorry you had to be part of this." "Now to bed, all of us," Margaret declared when the plans were settled. "We needs to act normal tomorrow. Any change in routine will draw attention." As Dorman climbed the stairs to his room, he couldn't help feeling that everything had changed in a single night. His father, the most honest man he knew, was smuggling rum. His mother, always proper and law-abiding, was now an accomplice. And he himself had just helped hide contraband. Yet strangely, he didn't feel the shame or guilt he might have expected. Instead, he felt a new kind of connection to his parents, a sense of being treated as something more than a child. They had trusted him with their secret, relied on his help when they needed it most. It left him with an energizing feeling of adventure, an intoxicating feeling he enjoyed. As he drifted towards sleep, Dorman found himself wondering what other adult responsibilities might await him in the days ahead, and listening to the muffled pinging noise coming from the tins inside the wall as the tins cooled off as the wood stove died down in the wee hours of the night. Chapter 3. The Reckoning. The following morning, Dorman rose early despite his exhaustion, determined to maintain his normal routine. His mother was already in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with the same steady hands that had helped move contraband rum mere hours before. "Your father's still sleeping?" she said quietly as Dorman entered. "His back needs to rest. I want you to go to school as usual today, Dorman. Act normal." "Yes, Mum," he replied, pouring himself a cup of tea. "What if someone asks about Da?" "Just say he's resting because of his back. It's true enough." Margaret shaped the dough with practiced movements. "And remember, not a word about last night to anyone, not even Emily Parsons." Dorman nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. As he left for school, he noticed a Mountie patrol making its way along the harbor front, Constable Griggs and the unfamiliar officer who had arrived with him. They showed no particular interest in the Keating house, but their presence was an uncomfortable reminder of what lay hidden beneath their stares. School dragged endlessly that day. Mr. Fletcher's lessons on Canadian governance seemed pointless compared to the real-life drama unfolding in Dorman's own family. During lunch break, Emily found him sitting alone beneath the schoolyard's lone pine tree. "You disappeared yesterday, Darm," she said, settling beside him. "Everything all right at home?" "Fine," he answered, perhaps too quickly. "Da's back is acting up again. Nothing serious." Emily studied his face with the careful observation she'd inherited from her physician father. "You're not telling me everything. Does it have to do with what we saw? Your Da's boat at McAllister's stage?" Dorman shrugged, avoiding her eyes. "Just engine trouble. Uncle Danny towed him in." "My father had an interesting visitor this morning," Emily continued casually. "Constable Griggs. They were talking about Saint Pierre and smuggling operations." Dorman's heart skipped. "Lots of smugglers around these days. Not our business." "Darm," Emily's voice softened. "If your family's in trouble, maybe my father could help. He has influence, wit—" "We don't need help," Dorman interrupted more sharply than he intended. "And there's nothing to worry about. Just leave it alone, Em." Hurt flashed across her face, and Dorman immediately regretted his tone. But he couldn't risk confiding in her, not when his father's freedom might depend on his silence. "I'm sorry," he added more gently. "Just tired. Da's back means extra chores for me." Emily nodded, though her expression remained concerned. "Just be careful, Darm. Whatever's going on, be careful." The exchange left Dorman unsettled for the remainder of the day. Emily's mention of Griggs consulting with her father suggested the Mounties were actively pursuing their investigation, not just making routine inquiries. Would they connect Jack to Danny's smuggling operation? Had anyone seen them moving tins last night? By the time school ended, Dorman was bursting with anxiety. Instead of heading straight home, he took a detour past the harbor, hoping to gauge whether there was any unusual activity around the Briny Rose or the government dock where the Mountie boat was moored. What he saw was shocking. Constable Bateman was aboard the Briny Rose, methodically searching the hold. From his vantage point behind a stack of traps, Dorman could see the officer examining the engine compartment where the sabotage had occurred, taking notes on a small pad. Heart pounding, Dorman raced home to warn his parents. When Jack finally made it down to the dock, it was late morning. Danny had moved the Rose to Jack's dock site through the night. He wasn't exactly shocked to see Constable Griggs waiting beside the briny Rose. His back still ached ferociously, but he'd forced himself to the harbor, knowing that any deviation from his normal routine might raise suspicion. The Mountie was alone, hands clasped behind his back, face impassive as he watched Jack approach. "Good morning, Mr. Keating," Griggs called. "Heard you had some trouble with your boat yesterday." Jack forced his features into what he hoped was a casual expression. "Aye. Fuel line split and cooling system went. Lucky me, brother was passing by on his way back from Fortune Bay." Griggs nodded, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "Would you mind if I take a look? You know, I always had an interest in marine engines." It wasn't really a request. Jack gestured for him to follow, heart hammering as he led the way aboard. The hold was empty now, the 50 tins safely hidden at home, the other 50 secure in the secret compartment below their feet. But would there be some telltale sign he'd overlooked? A lingering scent of rum, a forgotten tin, some evidence of his crime? "That's some nasty damage," Griggs commented as they examined the engine. "Almost looks deliberate." Jack stiffened. Old engines can fail in strange ways. The constable straightened, his gaze sweeping the hold. "Where were you fishing, Mr. Keating?" "Fortune Bay area," Jack lied, the words bitter on his tongue. "Not much luck, though." Griggs made a non-committal sound, running his hand along the gunwale as he moved around the boat. "Your brother seems to be having better fortune lately. The Queen's Bounty is quite an impressive vessel." "Danny's always had the Midas touch," Jack said, forcing a casual tone. "Some men just have the right instincts for where the fish will be." The constable peered into the empty hold, his expression thoughtful. "Interesting. Most men with the right instincts tend to come back with actual fish." Jack said nothing, acutely aware that any response might dig his hole deeper. "You know, Jack," Griggs continued conversationally, "I never knew your father. Thomas, quite a fisherman in his day from what I hear." Jack tensed at the mention of his father. "Aye, Daddy certainly was. Shame about his troubles with the bottle. Cost him a lot. Reputation, family, eventually his life." Griggs met Jack's eyes directly. "Always thought it strange how a man could risk everything for something so fleeting as the temporary comfort of rum. Wouldn't you agree?" The message couldn't have been clearer if Griggs had spelled it out. He knew or strongly suspected what Jack had been doing. The question was whether he had proof. "My father made his choices," Jack said carefully. "Some better than others." "Indeed, as we all do." Griggs adjusted his hat. "Well, I won't keep you from your repairs, Mr. Keating, though I might stop by again tomorrow. Always curious about how things develop." As the constable walked away, Jack remained rooted to the spot, cold sweat dampening his shirt despite the cool morning. Griggs was fishing, probing for a reaction, a confession, any sign of guilt, and he'd nearly gotten one. A week, Jack reminded himself. A week until Danny's buyer came, and the goods were gone. Surely they could maintain their facade for that long. But as he watched Griggs's retreating figure, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out faster than they could have anticipated. Dorman burst through the door in panic. "The Mounties are searching the Rose," he exclaimed. "Constable Bateman's been on her all afternoon, looking at everything." Jack and Margaret exchanged alarmed glances. "Did he find anything?" Jack asked. Dorman shook his head. "Don't think so, but he was taking notes, looking real careful at the engine." "He'll see the repairs I made at sea," Jack murmured. "He'll know the fuel line damage wasn't accidental. Griggs sent him there." "I gave Griggs a tour of the Rose this morning," said Jack, and Eyes gave him permission for his inspector to look it over. Margaret's practical mind immediately assessed their options. "What about dose tins on the boat, Jack? For the Lord's sake, we're finished if they find 'em. Margaret, trust me, they'll never find those tins on the rows. They'll have to tear the whole boat apart to do so, Jack said calmly. A knock on the door startled them all. The three Keatings froze, exchanging alarmed glances. Nobody was expected at this hour, and visitors were the last thing they needed with 50 tins of contraband rum hidden beneath their stairs. I'll get it, Jack said quietly, motioning for Margaret and Dorman to stay put. He moved cautiously toward the door, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for confrontation. Through the small window beside the door, he caught a glimpse of a familiar silhouette, Danny shifting nervously from foot to foot on the doorstep. Jack's tension eased slightly, though his brother's unexpected appearance couldn't be good news. He opened the door just wide enough to slip through, then stepped outside and pulled it closed behind him. The night air was cold against his face, carrying the scent of salt and wood smoke that defined Burgeo evenings. What's wrong? Jack asked quietly. Danny glanced past him toward the house, then at the dark shapes of neighboring homes whose windows glowed with warm lamplight. We need to talk, he muttered, pulling up his collar against the chill. Jack nodded toward the woodshed at the edge of the yard, where they'd be sheltered from both the wind and prying eyes. The brothers walked in silence, their footsteps crunching on the frost-covered ground, breath clouding in the cold air. Neither spoke until they were safely inside the small structure, surrounded by stacked firewood and the comforting smell of pine sap. How's the weather? Danny asked, their old childhood code for, is it safe to talk? Clear enough, Jack replied, indicating they were alone. Danny nodded, lowering his voice anyway. Telegram just came in. The pickup man's arriving tonight, not next week. Jack stiffened. What, this soon? Why the last-minute change? Too many eyes watching the harbor lately, Danny explained. He wants to move faster. Says waiting a week might be too late. He only wants aft, 50 tins for now. Jack studied his brother's face, noting the shadows under his eyes, the slight tremor in his normally steady hands. What aren't you telling me, Danny? Danny glanced around before stepping closer. I told you about that black hull boat I've been seeing? It was back yesterday, anchored just off Small Point. I recognize one of the men aboard, works for a rival outfit out of Sydney. What does that mean for us? Asked Jack. It means tings are getting crowded, Danny replied grimly. Too many players, too much scrutiny. Our pickup man wants to complete the deal and clear out before anything messy happens. The change in schedule set Jack's nerves on edge. They'd been preparing for a transaction next week, not tonight. Rushing now increased their risk. What time tonight? Jack asked, his voice tight. Midnight at McAllister's stage, Danny confirmed. Same place as we'd planned, just sooner. Jack nodded, his mind already adjusting to the new timeline. I'll tell Margaret. We'll be ready and move the tins to the stage as soon as it gets dark. It's gonna rain tonight, Jack continued. And other tins on the rows. We'll leave them for now. It's far too risky to move the Rose or the Queen right now. The Mounties would be all over us. Maybe we can do a transfer from boat to boat later on for the next exchange, Danny said. Danny's relief was visible. Smart, brother. Very smart. He turned to leave, then paused. One more ting. Buyers bringing help. Insurance, he calls it. Jack's blood ran cold. What do you mean insurance? It's standard for shipments this size, Danny explained, his expression apologetic. Nothing to worry about if everything goes smooth. Just make sure everything goes smooth, yeah? Danny, do these guys have guns? Asked Jack. Jack knew the answer from the lack of answer from Danny, who just shrugged and left saying he had a lot to do to get ready. When Jack returned to the house and told Margaret about the change in plans, her face drained of color. Tonight? She whispered, sinking into a kitchen chair. Jack, that's too soon. We're not prepared. We have to be. No choice, Jack countered, though he shared her unease. Same plan, just accelerated. Margaret shook her head, something like prophecy in her eyes. Russian never leads to anything good, Jack, especially not in matters like this. Jack had no response to that, because deep in his gut, he knew she was right. The day of the exchange crawled by with excruciating slowness. Jack remained at home in the morning, ostensibly nursing his back injury, but actually unable to face Constable Griggs again. Margaret moved through her normal routine with forced casualness, attending a church women's meeting in the afternoon, exchanging pleasantries with neighbors who had no idea of the contraband hidden beneath her stairs. Dorman went off to school as usual. Dorman Keating sat at his desk by the window, only half listening to Mr. Fletcher drone on about the benefits of Confederation. The teacher's mainland accent still grated after 3 years in Burgeo, his tendency to speak as if explaining things to children particularly irritating to his teenage students. The union with Canada has brought modern governance to Newfoundland, Fletcher was saying, along with improved infrastructure, health care, and, yes, Dorman lowered his raised hand. Sir, me grandfather said Confederation just traded one set of masters for another. Said we sold our birthright for a few roads and a monthly check. A ripple of suppressed laughter ran through the classroom. Fletcher's expression tightened. Your grandfather, like many of his generation, was understandably resistant to change, the teacher replied stiffly. But progress requires adaptation, and me father says the new fishing regulations are killing small operators. Dorman continued, emboldened by the supportive glances from his classmates. Big companies from the mainland get the best quotas, while local fishermen can barely make ends meet. That's enough, Darm, Mr. Aubrey Fletcher said sharply. Most students called him simply Fletcher, though the younger ones still use the more formal address. This is history class, not a political debate. Please save your family's opinions for the dinner table. Dorman subsided. Chiding Mr. Fletcher was one of his favorite hobbies. Sometimes he pushes old Fletch too far, and out comes old Tanner, which had taught respect to 3 generations of Burgeo youngsters. Old Tanner wasn't just any leather strap. It was a well-worn piece of history hanging ominously behind Mr. Fletcher's desk, dark and weathered as a fisherman's palm after 40 years at sea. Nearly 2 feet of thick saddle leather, its once sharp edges rounded by decades of reluctant acquaintance with outport boys' hands and backsides. Old-timers in Burgeo claimed it had started life as part of a harness from Dr. Parsons' grandfather's horse, cut and fashioned special when the first of the teachers came to teach. Its mahogany color came not from dye, but from years of absorbing fish oil and sweat from countless young hands that had reached out, trembling when ordered to put her dare, boy. When Fletcher reached for old Tanner, the classroom would fall silent enough to hear a Kaplan gasp, and even the toughest harbor rats would suddenly discover a newfound interest in their arithmetic. The momentary distraction had served its purpose, diverting his thoughts from his family's precarious situation. Through the classroom window, Dorman could see the harbor, where the briny Rose bobbed gently at her mooring. Beyond, the water stretched toward invisible horizons, toward Saint Pierre, toward the French islands that seemed to be at the center of the trouble swirling around his family. During lunch break, he slipped away to Barter's Rock, scanning the harbor with anxious eyes. The Mounties boat remained at the government dock. The briny Rose sat untouched in her berth. No sign of unusual activity, yet Dorman couldn't shake the sensation that invisible forces were converging on his family. Constable Albert Griggs spread the surveillance photographs across his desk in the small RCMP office, the only official Canadian government building in Burgeo. The images showed the briny Rose docked at a small pier in Saint Pierre from a few nights earlier, with Jack Keating clearly visible on deck. Another showed crates of tins, and another showing uncrated tins being loaded under cover of darkness, early morning mist. These tins being a new development from barrels. Headquarters finally sent these over, he told Constable Bateman, who stood examining the evidence with him. French authorities took them as part of their own investigation into Martel's operation. So we've confirmed Keating's involvement, Bateman observed, but nothing concrete on the brother yet. Griggs tapped another photograph, this one showing the Brenny Rose being towed into the harbor opening of Burgeo 2 days ago, riding noticeably low in the water despite an empty fish hold. Jack Keating left port ostensibly for fishing grounds near Fortune Bay. No catch reported, no fish unloaded. And look how she sits in the water here. Only thing he had to show was damaged engine. Heavy was something, Bateman agreed, but without catching him with contraband. I know. We need more. Griggs sat back, considering their options. He'd served in Europe during the war before joining the force, and something about this operation reminded him of resistance networks, the careful signals, the coded language, the community protection. The way I see it, something's happening soon. The rum has to be somewhere in Burgeo right now, waiting for distribution. Question is, where? Could be anywhere. Fishing shed, abandoned building, someone's cellar. No, Griggs shook his head. Keating's too careful for that. He wouldn't leave it somewhere easily discovered. He tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the desk. What about Jack's house? We know the brothers met this morning. We'd need a warrant for that, Bateman pointed out. Judge Parsons won't issue one on suspicion alone. He's got family in Burgeo. Connections. Then we wait and watch, Griggs decided, his weathered face showing the determination that had earned him commendations during the war. Tonight we follow both Keatings. Don't let them out of our sight. Eventually they'll lead us to the contraband, and let's keep eyes on that McAllister's stage. We have 2 more constables to help now. Bateman nodded, collecting the photographs into a folder. What about the boy? Keating's son. Kids notice things. Might let something slip at school. Griggs considered this, then shook his head. Dorman Keating's a good lad. Close-mouthed like his father. Besides, involving children isn't how we operate. He stood, reaching for his coat. No, we focus on the brothers. Something's going to break soon. I can feel it. The autumn wind had picked up outside, carrying the first hints of winter's approach. Griggs buttoned his coat against the chill, his mind already planning the evening's surveillance. There was something about this case that bothered him beyond the simple smuggling aspect. Reports from Halifax suggested the rum-running from Saint Pierre was becoming increasingly organized, with connections to larger criminal elements on the mainland. What had begun as local fishermen supplementing their income might be evolving into something more dangerous. And Jack Keating, a man with a reputation for honesty suddenly involved in smuggling, that transition troubled Griggs most of all. He'd seen good men make bad choices before, often with devastating consequences. If he could wrap this up quickly, perhaps Keating might still salvage something of his former life. The church social hall was bustling with activity as Margaret arranged cookies on serving platters, her hands steady despite the anxiety churning inside her. Around her, the women of Burgeo prepared for Saturday's autumn festival, a tradition dating back generations. Your oatmeal cookies are always the first to go, Sarah Parsons commented, setting a tablecloth nearby. What's your secret ingredient? Just a touch more cinnamon than most, Margaret replied automatically, her thoughts far from baking. She'd volunteered for the preparations partly from genuine community spirit, but mostly to establish her normal routine for watching eyes. If the Mounties were investigating Jack, they'd be observing his family too. Better to be seen behaving as expected, participating in village life as she always had. The social hall, attached to the Anglican Church, had served as Burgeo's gathering place for decades. Its wooden floors were worn smooth by generations of dancing feet, its walls adorned with fading photographs of fishing crews and church picnics from years past. Today it smelled of beeswax polish and fresh-baked goods, a comforting familiarity that contrasted sharply with Margaret's inner turmoil. "Everything all right, Margaret?" Nora asked, her voice dropping to a concerned murmur. "You seem distracted." Margaret forced a smile. "Just worried about Jack's boat. Engine troubles again. You know how it is. A fisherman without a working boat might as well be missing a limb." Nora nodded sympathetically. "Eli says the new regulations have everyone struggling. Hardly seems fair, does it? All these years fishing these waters, and suddenly mainlanders telling us where and when we can drop our nets." The conversation shifted to the familiar complaints about Confederation's impact on their lives, and Margaret let it flow around her, offering appropriate nods and murmurs of agreement. Part of her was already back home, calculating how many ways the plan could go catastrophically wrong if the Mounties were indeed watching. As she arranged the last platter of cookies, Margaret noticed Emily Parsons watching her from across the hall. The girl quickly looked away, but not before Margaret caught the concern in her expression. Did Emily know something? Had she told Dorman everything she knew? "Margaret, we're discussing the music for Saturday." Sarah's voice broke through her thoughts. "Sorry, just remembering I need to check on me bread at home." Margaret apologized. "What were you saying about the music?" As the conversation resumed, Margaret made a silent promise to herself. After tonight, after the tins were gone, she would ensure Jack never ventured into such waters again. Unlike Thomas's long-suffering wife, she wouldn't stand by while her family was sacrificed to rum, whether through drinking it or trafficking in it. "Where do you suppose Darm's got to now?" Emily Parsons asked Lucy Lake as they scanned the schoolyard during afternoon recess. Lucy shrugged, adjusting her scarf against the brisk October wind. "Probably just late. You knows how Mr. Fletcher hates when students don't return prompt after break." But Emily wasn't convinced. Dorman had been acting strangely all morning, distracted during lessons, starting at every sound from the corridor. Then he disappeared at lunch without explanation, returning just before class resumed, tight-lipped and evasive. "I'm going to look for him," Emily decided, tucking her lunch pail under a bench. "Cover for me if Fletcher comes out." "Emily, don't!" Lucy protested, but her friend was already moving toward the school gates. Emily had a good idea where to look. When Dorman wanted to escape notice, he often retreated to Barter's Rock, the outcropping that provided the best view of the harbor. Sure enough, as she approached, she could make out his slim figure perched near the top, staring intently toward the water. "Darm!" she called, breathless from the climb. "What you doing? We'll be in trouble if it—" "Just tinking," he interrupted, not meeting her eyes. "About what you told me, about the Mounties watching every ting." Emily flopped down beside him, being sure to rest herself against him, following his gaze toward the harbor, where the briny rows bobbed gently at her mooring. "So it is true? About your Don uncle?" Dorman hesitated, then realized Emily had pieced things together through fragments of information. Noticing the Rose's unusual movements, overhearing her father's conversations, observing Uncle Danny's suspicious behavior, but she couldn't know the full extent of what had happened the previous night. She was smart, but even she couldn't have deduced everything. "It was just one time," Dorman said defensively, "to help fix the Rose. He's not like Uncle Danny." Emily's eyes widened at this confirmation. "Then he needs to stay away from dis. Da says die penalties for smuggling are serious. Your father could go to prison." Dorman seemed to waver, torn between loyalty to his family and the undeniable logic of Emily's argument. The harbor stretched below them, the village beyond. His entire world, suddenly threatened by forces he could barely comprehend. I warned him already, he admitted, but he's still going true, so he needs to help Uncle Danny. Then let him help your uncle and come straight home, Emily urged. Please, Darm, don't let him stay there when the buyers come. After a long moment, Dorman nodded. I'll try, but Da's stubborn when his mind's made up. Then make sure he knows exactly what he's risking. Emily stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. We should get back. Fletcher will be looking for us. As they hurried back toward the school, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Dorman wasn't being entirely forthright. There was a determined set to his jaw that suggested he had plans of his own, plans that might lead to trouble for them all. By evening, tension filled the Keating household like a physical presence, unspoken but omnipresent. They ate dinner in near silence, the only sound the scrape of forks against plates and the ticking of the old clock on the mantel, each minute bringing them closer to 9 o'clock and whatever fate awaited them at McAllister's stage. After dinner, while Margaret washed dishes with methodical precision, Jack took Dorman aside in the sitting room. I need you to stay here tonight, he said, his voice firm but gentle. I need you to load the cart. My back is good enough now I can manage on the path with a little help from your mum. We'll need to make a couple of trips. Keep the doors locked. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you stay inside. Understand? Dorman wanted to protest, to insist on coming along, to argue that he deserved to be part of whatever unfolded, but something in his father's eyes stopped him, a vulnerability he'd never seen before, a desperation for this one promise. Yes, sir, he said, though the words tasted false on his tongue. I'll stay here. Jack studied his son's face, perhaps sensing the conflict behind the obedient response. I mean it, Dorm. This is dangerous business. I never should have gotten involved, never should have brought this to our doorstep. He placed his hands on Dorman's shoulders, suddenly looking older than his years. Let me finish it. Let me make this right. The raw emotion in his father's voice almost broke Dorman's resolve. Almost. But as Jack turned away, satisfied with his son's acquiescence, Dorman knew he couldn't honor that promise. Too much was at stake, his father's safety, their family's future, perhaps even their lives. After dark at 8:30, Jack and Margaret prepared to leave. Dark clothing, rubber-soled shoes for silence, the handcart waiting by the back door. The 50 tins had been rewrapped in cloth to prevent noise, stacked in neat rows ready for transport. Dorman had the first load ready to go. After returning with an empty cart 2 hours later for the last load, Jack turned to Dorm. We'll be back, son, if we're not back by morning. Go to Aunt Brenda's in Porto Basque, Dorman finished for him. I remember. Jack nodded, then surprised his son by pulling him into a fierce embrace. You're a good lad, he whispered. Better than I deserve. Whatever happens, remember that. The unexpected display of emotion frightened Dorman more than anything else had. It felt like goodbye. After his parents slipped out the back door with the final load of contraband heading to McAllister's stage, Dorman waited precisely 10 minutes, counting each second on the mantel clock. Then he grabbed his jacket, pulled on his boots, and headed for the window rather than the door. They would expect him to follow the path. Instead, he would cut across the Turner property, circle behind the village, and approach McAllister's stage from the opposite direction. As he moved through the darkness, Dorman recalled his father's instructions about the Rose's secret compartment, the brass nail head that looked like a knot in the wood. Press twice, then slide the panel. 50 tins hidden where no one would think to look unless they knew the secret. Knowledge was power, and Dorman intended to use that power, not to disobey his father out of childish rebellion, but to protect his family if things went wrong. Because despite the reassurances, despite the carefully laid plans, Dorman couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would end in disaster. The fog had thickened as darkness fell, cloaking Burgio in a ghostly shroud. perfect cover for a smuggling operation or an ambush. Dorman moved carefully through the thick, wet mist, every sense alert for danger. The village fell away behind him as he navigated the rocky coastal path, guided more by memory than sight. Ahead, barely visible through the fog, loomed McAllister's stage, the setting for whatever drama would unfold in the next hour. Dorman settled into a sheltered spot among the rocks, high enough to observe without being seen, close enough to hear what transpired. From his vantage point, he could see his parents arriving with the handcart, moving the tins inside the stage where Uncle Danny waited. Beyond the stage, the black water of the cove reflected no stars, no moon. Just darkness waiting to be pierced by the running lights of a buyer's boat that might bring salvation or destruction. All Dorman could do now was watch and wait and pray that somehow, when this night ended, his family would still be whole. As it closed in on midnight, the thick fog turned into heavy drizzle, then that changed into light, steady rain. As the minutes ticked by, Dorman saw movement at the tree line and tensed as a tall figure emerged from the shadows. Even from a distance, the uniform was unmistakable. Constable Griggs. The Mounties had found them. Dorman's heart pounded against his ribs as he watched his father step outside to meet the officer. Their voices were too low to hear, but their tense postures told him everything. Then from the direction of the water came a sound, the steady hum of a boat engine, distinct from the usual fishing vessels of Burgeo. Smoother, more powerful. The pickup man was arriving at the worst possible moment. More movement in the shadows, Danny appearing with something in his hand that gleamed in the faint light. A gun. His uncle had a gun. Unable to remain hidden any longer, Dorman scrambled down from his hiding place. Whatever happened tonight, he wouldn't watch from the shadows. His family needed him. "Uncle Danny, watch out!" he shouted as he sprinted toward the stage. What happened next unfolded with nightmarish speed. The cabin cruiser's engines suddenly roared to life, the vessel executing a sharp turn at the sight of the law enforcement presence. Shouts echoed from multiple directions as more Mounties emerged from concealment. Lights blazed from a government patrol boat that had silently moved into position, blocking the harbor exit. Danny stopped at Dorman's warning, but then continued his headlong flight toward the stage where Margaret waited. Constable Griggs drew his service weapon, shouting, "Police! Stop or I'll shoot!" Jack moved instinctively, breaking away from Griggs to intercept both his brother and son. "Danny, stop! It's over! Dorm, get back!" But Danny either didn't hear or chose to ignore him. Then from the cruiser erupted gunfire. Not the revolvers the Mounties carried, but automatic weapons. 2 thugs on the boat held 2 Tommy guns, automatic .45 caliber machine guns like those used in the old gangster movies. The staccato blast cut through the night air, bullets spraying wildly toward the shore, where the law officers frantically sought cover. The 2 gunmen unloaded on everything in sight. With precise coordination, they both turned their guns on the boat, blocking their exit. The RCMP boat, outgunned and unprepared for such resistance, began to retreat toward the harbor entrance, firing sporadically as it withdrew. On shore, the Mounties were hiding behind whatever cover they could find, no match for the automatic firepower. Dorman collided with Danny, both staggering. Griggs tripped and fortunately rolled out of sight unharmed. Jack reached them just as Danny jerked suddenly, then crumpled to the ground with Dorman still tangled with him. "No!" Jack's anguished cry tore from his throat as he pulled Dorman clear. His son appeared unharmed, just shocked, but Danny lay motionless, a dark stain spreading across his chest where a bullet had found its way through Tohim. Chaos erupted around them. The cabin cruiser accelerated away into the fog as the smugglers continued to fire, bullets churning the water behind them. In their retreat, they fired wildly at McAllister's stage, splinters flying as rounds punched through the weathered wood. One bullet struck a lantern inside, shattering glass and spilling kerosene onto the floor. A few more 45 caliber rounds punched through a few tins of rum. In seconds, flames raced across the dry planking, spreading rapidly toward the stacked rum tins. "Margaret!" Jack shouted, sudden terror gripping him as he remembered his wife was still inside the burning structure. But Margaret was already emerging, coughing and stumbling through the door as smoke billowed behind her. Jack pulled Dorman toward her, away from Danny's motionless form, away from the intensifying fire. As the gunfire from the boat finally paused, Griggs emerged from cover and rushed to the fallen man. Jack turned to see Griggs kneeling beside his brother, hands pressing futilely against the wound in Danny's chest. The constable's expression told Jack everything he needed to know. "He's losing too much blood," Griggs said grimly. "We need to get him to a doctor immediately." But even as he spoke, Danny's eyes found Jack's, a strange clarity in them despite the pain. Rain had started to fall, plastering his hair to his forehead, washing away some of the blood on his face, making him look suddenly young, like the boy Jack had protected so fiercely when they were children. "Jackie," he whispered, voice barely audible over the confusion around them. "Take care of Dorm. Don't let him become me." Jack gripped his brother's hand, throat too tight for words. He only managed a low whisper. "Oh, Danny. My Danny boy." A moment later, Danny's eyes glazed over, his final breath escaping in a soft sigh that seemed to dissolve into the surrounding fog. Time seemed to suspend itself as Jack knelt there, still holding his brother's lifeless hand. Dorman silent and shocked beside him. The rain fell steadily now, mixing with the tears on Jack's face, washing Danny's blood into the dark earth beneath them. Meanwhile, the fire ravaging McAllister's stage grew more intense. The dry wood, soaked with decades of fish oil and salt spray, burned fiercely despite the rain. As the flames reached the first of the rum tins, a tremendous explosion rocked the night, a blue-orange fireball that sent burning debris in all directions. One by one, the remaining tins ignited, each explosion seemingly more powerful than the last as the heat intensified. Within minutes, the entire structure was engulfed, belching black smoke into the night sky as all 50 tins fueled an inferno visible for miles around. Jack held his son and his wife. The drizzle now turned into steady rain. As he held the dearest, most precious things in and of his whole existence, he looked down at Danny, tears and blood mixing with the rain. Eventually, Griggs' voice penetrated the haze of grief. "Jack Keating, I'm placing you under arrest for smuggling contraband spirits." The quiet town was waking up now, houses lighting up, dogs barking, voices calling back and forth through the community. Little did they know the night's tragedy wasn't yet complete. Jack looked up, numb. "My son had nothing to do with this. He followed me without my knowledge. The same with my wife." Griggs nodded, his expression somber but not unkind. "I believe you. We'll need to question him, but I've no intention of charging a child, nor your wife." He helped Jack to his feet. "I'm sorry about your brother. The shooter was aiming for my officers and me, I suspect. I will have to confiscate the Briny Rose. Don't panic. If nothing is found on her, it will be released into possession of your wife, if she wishes." Jack barely registered the words, his focus entirely on Dorman, who stood pale and shaking, staring at his uncle's body as Bateman covered it with a tarp. "Can I have a moment with my family?" Jack asked quietly. Griggs hesitated, then nodded. "1 minute, then need to get you to Port Basque. The magistrate will want to see you first thing tomorrow." Jack knelt before Dorman, taking the boy's cold hands in his. "Listen to me, Dorm. This isn't your fault. None of it. Do you understand?" Dorman nodded jerkily, tears streaming down his face. "But if I hadn't come, then something else would have happened." Jack cut him off gently. What's done is done. I need you to be strong now, for your mother. Are they taking you to jail? Dorman asked, his voice small. For a while, yes, Jack admitted, but not forever. I made a mistake, and now I has to face the consequences. That's what men do, Dorm. They owns their mistakes. Dorman's chin came up at that, a flicker of the strong young man he was becoming visible through his grief. I'll take care of Mum, he promised, and the Rose too. I knows you will. Jack pulled him into a fierce embrace, memorizing the feel of his son's thin shoulders, the smell of his hair. Then he whispered so softly only Dorman could hear, I loves you, son. When they separated, Jack looked up to see Margaret, her wet face ashen in the firelight. Margaret, he said, rising to meet her, I'm so sorry. She was clearly shaken and in shock. The whole town likely was. Jack, the gunfire. What the hell happened here? Her eyes fell on the tarp-covered form nearby, and her voice caught. She could hardly speak. Danny? Gone, Jack confirmed, the word hollow in his mouth. Shot by the buyer's men? Margaret closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this fresh blow. When she opened them again, they were clear and focused, despite the rain that continued to fall. What happens now? I'm being taken to Port aux Basques, Jack explained. There will be a hearing, then likely a trial. I'll find a lawyer, Margaret said immediately, practical even in crisis. And I'll bring Dorman to see you as soon as they allows visitors. Time to go, Mr. Keating, Constable Bateman interrupted gently, handcuffs ready. Jack nodded, then addressed his family one last time. I loves you both. Remember that? As Bateman secured the cuffs around Jack's wrists, a sudden commotion erupted behind them. Jack turned to see one of the Mounties running from what remained of the stage, shouting a warning. Fire's spreading. The whole structure's collapsing. The officers hurried Jack toward the government boat, not wanting their prisoner caught in the conflagration. From the water they watched as McAllister's stage disappeared in a final, spectacular blaze, the last of the rum tins exploding like fireworks against the night sky. Well, Mr. Keating, Griggs observed as their boat pulled away from shore, there goes the physical evidence from this shipment. But we still have the photographs from Saint Pierre showing your boat at Martel's dock. And your presence here tonight is damning enough, and your boat will be inspected for evidence as well. Jack nodded, watching as the flaming remnants of McAllister's stage illuminated the small cove with an eerie dancing light. Faces of villagers who had come running at the sound of gunfire and explosions were now visible at the edges of the clearing, their expressions shocked and fearful as they witnessed the destruction. Among them, Jack spotted Dr. Parsons, Emily and her mother, and several of his neighbors, all witnesses to his disgrace, to Danny's death, to the end of the Keating brothers' brief career in smuggling. As the boat carried him away from Burgeo, away from everything he loved, Jack thought about the 50 tins still hidden aboard the Briny Rose, a secret inheritance for Dorman, should he choose to use it. He wasn't worried about them finding the tins. They already inspected the Rose twice and didn't find anything. Jack had started with the best intentions. One run to save his boat, feed his family, preserve his independence as a fisherman. Now his brother was dead, his freedom forfeited, and his son tasked with responsibilities no 13-year-old should bear. Yet even in this darkest moment, Jack felt a strange sense of clarity. He would face his punishment, bear it with the dignity his father had never managed. And when it was over, he would return to Burgeo and rebuild what he'd broken. His family's trust, his reputation, his self-respect. The path forward was difficult but clear. But unknown to Jack, looking back from the departing police boat, Dorman stood straight back beside his mother, the secret knowledge of the Briny Rose's hidden treasure already shaping his thoughts. 50 tins of contraband rum, a fortune that could sustain them while his father was away, if managed carefully. or ruin them completely if discovered. As Margaret wrapped a protective arm around her son, Dorman made a silent vow. He would protect his mother, maintain the Rose, and preserve their family's future, using whatever means necessary, including the unexpected legacy his father and uncle had inadvertently left him. The boy who had left home that evening returned a different person, older, harder, shouldering responsibilities and secrets no child should carry. Yet in that transformation lay not just the seeds of potential destruction, but also of remarkable resilience, the kind that had defined Newfoundlanders for generations, allowing them to survive the harshest conditions, the most devastating losses, the most profound changes. 3 days later, Jack sat in a bare interview room in the Porto Basques jailhouse, waiting for his appointed lawyer. The past 72 hours had passed in a blur of procedural questions, formal charges, and sleepless nights in a cell whose iron bars and concrete walls seemed to echo with the ghosts of other men's mistakes. The Porto Basques jail was a stark contrast to Burgio's weather-worn charm. Built of gray stone and steel, it represented mainland authority, a physical reminder of Newfoundland's new status as Canada's youngest province. Even the guards spoke with mainland accents, their clipped tones lacking the musical lilt of the outport communities. The door opened to admit a trim, middle-aged man in a well-worn but respectable suit, carrying a leather portfolio. "Mr. Keating, I'm Howard Parsons. I've been assigned to your case." Jack shook the offered hand. "Any relation to de Parsons family in Burgio?" "Distant cousins," the lawyer acknowledged with a small smile. "However, Dr. Parsons is picking up me bill. He holds a lot of admiration for you, Jack. Anyhow, I was raised in St. John's, so no conflicts of interest." He arranged his papers on the table between them, then fixed Jack with a direct gaze. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Keating. The charges against you are serious. Smuggling contraband spirits carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 2 years under the current statutes." Jack nodded, having expected nothing less. "What about day shooting? Am I being charged for me brother's death?" "No," Parsons reassured him. "The French authorities have identified the shooter as René Dupont, a known associate of Louis Martel. They believe he was attempting to eliminate your brother to cover Martel's tracks. They RCMP are treating you as a witness in that matter, not a suspect." A small mercy, Jack thought, though it did little to ease the hollow ache in his chest whenever he thought of Danny. The image of his brother bleeding out in the rain returned unbidden. Danny's final moment of clarity after a life of shortcuts and easy answers. "There is some positive news," Parsons continued, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Your full cooperation has been noted by Constable Griggs. The loss of physical evidence in the fire at McAllister's stage doesn't help the prosecution's case, although they still have the photographs from Saint Pierre, and you have no prior criminal record, unlike your brother who had several minor infractions." "Will I be allowed visitors?" Jack asked, the question that had been foremost in his mind since his arrest. "Me wife and son?" "Yes, starting tomorrow. Visitation is Tuesday and Friday afternoons." Parsons hesitated, then added more gently, "Your brother's funeral service is scheduled for Thursday. I've submitted a request for you to attend under escort, but I must warn you it's unlikely to be granted. The authorities consider smuggling cases to have potential connections to organized crime." Jack nodded, throat tight. He'd expected as much, but the confirmation that he wouldn't be able to bid Danny a final farewell felt like yet another punishment, one that stung more deeply than the prospect of prison itself. The craggy coastline visible through the small window reminded Jack of home, of Burgio's resolute shores, of the briny Rose bobbing at her mooring with her secret cargo, of Dorman standing tall beside Margaret as the police boat had pulled away. Was his son now the man of the house at 13? The thought both pained and oddly comforted Jack. Dorman had always been resilient, like his mother. Now, Parsons said, opening his folder, let's discuss your plea. Given to evidence and your confession, I recommend. Guilty, Jack interrupted. I am guilty, Mr. Parsons. I knew what I was doing was wrong, and I did it anyway. I won't waste the court's time pretending otherwise. The lawyer studied him thoughtfully. You understand that pleading guilty means waiving your right to a trial? The judge will simply determine your sentence. I understand, Jack confirmed. I made a mistake. I'm prepared to face the consequences. Unlike his father, who had never taken responsibility for the havoc his drinking had wreaked, Jack would not hide from what he'd done. Parsons made a note in his file. Very well. In that case, we'll focus our efforts on mitigation, character witnesses, your personal circumstances, the fact that this was your first offense and unlikely to be repeated. Will it make a difference? Jack asked. It might, Parsons replied candidly. The mandatory minimum is 2 years, but the maximum is 7. Our job is to ensure you receive the lighter end of that spectrum. Judge McIntosh is fair but strict. He'll want to see genuine remorse, which I believe you have. 2 years. The number echoed in Jack's mind as Parsons continued discussing legal strategy. 2 years away from Margaret, from Dorman, from the briny rose. 2 years in which his son would continue growing, changing, becoming a man without his father's guidance. Yet even as the weight of it pressed down on him, Jack felt a strange sense of grim resolution. 2 years was the price of his mistake, the cost of the choice he'd made when he'd agreed to Danny's scheme. Unlike his father, who had spent decades avoiding responsibility for his actions, Jack would face his punishment squarely. And when it was over, he would return to Burgeo and rebuild what he'd broken: his family's trust, his reputation, his self-respect. The path forward was clear, if difficult. As Parsons gathered his papers to leave, Jack had one final question. Me boat, the briny rose. What will happen to her? Oh yes, de RCMP did a thorough inspection of her that turned up nothing of use for them. So your wife has been granted temporary ownership, Parsons informed him. She mentioned something about your son taking over the day-to-day operations while you're away. Despite everything, a small smile formed on Jack's lips. Dorman, running the Rose at 13. The boy would be a fine captain, with Margaret's steadying influence to guide him. And if Jack's suspicions were correct, Dorman now controlled more than just the boat. He had access to 50 tins of contraband rum that could sustain the family through the lean years ahead. It wasn't the legacy Jack had wanted to leave his son, but it was better than leaving him with nothing at all. Thank you, Mr. Parsons, Jack said, rising as the guard signaled the end of their meeting. I appreciate your honesty. The lawyer nodded, extending his hand again. I'll see you at the Erin on Monday. Try to get some rest before den. Rest, Jack thought as he was led back to his cell, seemed an unlikely prospect. But perhaps peace, the quiet acknowledgement that he was on the right path at last, might eventually be possible. Back in Burgeo, Dorman rose before dawn and slipped quietly from the house. His mother was still sleeping, exhausted from yesterday's ferry trip to Porto Basque, where they'd met with Jack's lawyer and arranged for the first official visit with his father later that week. The village was silent as Dorman made his way to the harbor where the briny Rose was moored. In the 3 days since his father's arrest, he had begun to understand what it meant to be the man of the house. His mother, though practical and strong, was overwhelmed with arrangements for Danny's funeral, meetings with lawyers, and the sympathetic but curious neighbors who came calling with casseroles and barely disguised questions. Dorman had taken it upon himself to check the briny Rose daily, ensuring she was secure, her bilge pumped, her hatches battened against the increasingly stormy October weather. Today he intended something more. Today he would take her out, proved to his mother and himself that he could handle his father's vessel alone. The eastern sky was lightening now, painting Burgeo Harbor in shades of pearl and pink. The sea was calm, barely a ripple disturbing its surface. Good conditions for a day's fishing. And fishing was exactly what Dorman intended to do. The more normal things appeared, the less likely anyone would be to suspect the depth of his family's turmoil. As he prepared the vessel for departure, Dorman thought about his father sitting in a Port au Basque jail cell, about his uncle's body being prepared for burial, about the exploding tins of contraband rum that had illuminated the night sky 3 days ago. It had been like something from a nightmare. The gunfire, Danny falling, his father being led away in handcuffs. Yet amid the horror, Dorman had found something unexpected, a new sense of purpose. His father needed him now, not as a child to be protected, but as someone who could help shoulder the family's burdens. The promise he'd made to take care of his mother and the Rose wasn't just empty words. It was a commitment he intended to honor. Before casting off, Dorman glanced around the harbor to ensure no one was watching, then made his way below deck. His heart quickened as he approached the section of planking that looked no different from any other part of the hull. Finding the brass nail head that resembled a common knot in the wood, he pressed it twice and held his breath as he slid the panel sideways on its hidden runners. The panel opened to reveal his treasure, 50 tins of contraband rum, gleaming dully in the dim light, neatly stacked in the compartment his father had built 6 years ago. Relief washed over him. The Mounties had searched the Rose yesterday, running their hands along every surface, looking in every crevice. Yet they'd found nothing. They'd stood right over this spot, never suspecting what lay beneath their feet. "Our insurance policy," he whispered, trailing his fingers lightly over the cool metal of the nearest tin. The secret was his alone now, a burden and a blessing that made him both boy and man at once. He slid the panel closed, watching as it disappeared seamlessly into the surrounding planking, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The Briny Rose's engine caught on the second try, the familiar thrum vibrating through the decking. Dorman felt a surge of pride. He'd been watching his father maintain that cantankerous engine for years, absorbing knowledge almost by osmosis. Now that learning was paying dividends. As he guided the Briny Rose away from the dock, Dorman noticed a few villagers pausing their morning routines to watch. Their expressions ranged from concern to approval as they recognized Jack Keating's son taking out his father's boat alone. In a community where boys often began working alongside their fathers at 10 or 11, a 13-year-old handling a fishing vessel wasn't unprecedented. But given recent events, Dorman knew he was being scrutinized more carefully than most. The morning air was bracing, the salt spray familiar against his face as the Briny Rose cut through the harbor waters. Behind him, Burgeo grew smaller, its cluster of houses and fishing stages dwindling against the rugged Newfoundland coastline. Ahead lay the fishing grounds where his father had taught him to set nets and haul traps since he was old enough to stand steadily on deck. Dorman adjusted course slightly, compensating for the current just as he'd seen his father do countless times. Jack had taught him well, not just how to sail a boat, but how to face consequences, how to protect family, how to find the honest path even after straying from it. As the Briny Rose reached deeper waters, Dorman allowed himself one backward glance toward home. Then, with the resolution of a Keating facing rough seas, he turned his gaze forward, to the horizon, to the future, to whatever lay ahead for a boy suddenly thrust into a man's responsibilities. The sun crested the eastern horizon as Dorman began to set his nets for the day's fishing. Its golden light caught the weathered planks of the Briny Rose, illuminating decades of history, 3 generations of Keating men who had worked these waters. Now it was his turn to carry that legacy forward, a legacy not of smuggling and shortcuts, but of hard work, integrity, and the resilience to weather even the fiercest storms. Yet as he worked, casting his nets with growing confidence, Dorman couldn't help thinking of the 50 tins hidden in the secret hold beneath his feet. A fortune in contraband, a secret he now kept from everyone. Those tins represented both temptation and security, a last resort he prayed they'd never need. He would try to make his father proud, to earn an honest living from the sea. But if the worst happened, if the fish didn't come, if the bills mounted too high, if his mother's health failed, he had options. The fact that his father was landed in jail using such an option only amounted to one meaning for Dorman. Like father, like son, so they say. "I'll make you proud, Dom," he murmured to the morning sky. "One way or another." The briny rose cut cleanly through the waves, her hull responding to his touch as if acknowledging the new captain at her helm. A boy forced too quickly into manhood, carrying not just his family's legacy, but their secrets as well. As the morning progressed and his nets began to show promise of a decent catch, Dorman felt a cautious optimism. Perhaps they could make it through this crisis with their integrity intact. Perhaps the 50 tins would remain forever hidden, a secret that would die with him. Perhaps his father would serve his time, return home, and never know the full extent of what his son had done to protect their family. The wind picked up slightly and Dorman adjusted the boat's heading with practiced ease. Whatever the future held, he would face it as a Keating, with courage, determination, and the hard-won knowledge that sometimes the most important battles are fought in silence, in the hidden spaces of the heart where conscience wrestles with necessity and love finds a way to triumph over fear. Far behind him, the smokestacks of Burgeo disappeared into the morning haze, taking with them the last visible reminder of the night that had changed everything. Ahead lay only the endless Atlantic and the promise of fish. Honest work for an honest day's pay, the kind his grandfather would have understood and approved of. But beneath his feet, 50 tins of contraband rum rode silent in their secret hold. A reminder that the line between salvation and damnation was often thinner than the planking that separated them from the searching light of day. The end, for now.